Before a single tower pierced the sky or a single arrow slit glared menacingly at the horizon, medieval builders had to confront a very real problem: the ground itself. Castles may look like declarations of power, but their roots, literally, were shaped by geology, engineering needs, political anxieties, and a medieval mindset that believed any problem could be solved by adding more stone and digging a suspiciously deep hole. The underground world of a castle wasn't an afterthought, it was the first step, the hidden skeleton, the quiet engine humming beneath the feudal drama happening above. The good news: your castle won't collapse. The bad news: you now live above a dungeon labyrinth designed by someone who hated sunlight. Hello travellers, histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Builders began underground because medieval Europe was essentially one large geological obstacle course. Limestone hills, chalk cliffs, granite plateaus, each region demanded its own engineering strategy. A castle anchored into soft earth risked leaning, sliding, or slowly sinking over the years like a very expensive stone pudding. So masons dug until they hit the stable layers of soil or bedrock, carving foundation trenches deep enough to hold the crushing weight of walls that could reach 10 meters thick. If you've ever wondered why castle basements often feel like caves, it's because they were caves, deliberately cut to ensure the above-ground world didn't topple over during the first storm or mild disagreement with gravity. But stability wasn't the only motivation. A castle was a statement. My lord is powerful, wealthy, and probably compensating for something. To maintain that illusion, the castle couldn't appear fragile. Its weight needed to be distributed across a broad subterranean base. Builders created stepped foundations, layer by layer, wider than the walls above, forming invisible stone pyramids buried under the turf. These hidden supports not only strengthened the building, but also unintentionally created new underground spaces. Medieval architects looked at these emerging cavities and thought, well, we dug them, might as well use them. Thus began the transformation of the undercroft from a structural accident into a functional world. Climate played its part too. Medieval Europe had no insulation, no central heating, and no weather forecast beyond. If the cows lie down, it might rain. Underground spaces solved several problems at once. They were cool in summer, stable in winter, and safe from wind and fire. Even the thickest castle walls couldn't regulate temperature like a natural earthen chamber. So from the very beginning, builders reserved underground rooms for things that needed reliability: food storage, valuable goods, and sometimes the occasional noble hiding from responsibility. Geopolitics, as always, contributed to a dose of paranoia. Castles weren't just homes, they were military bases, treasury vaults, judicial centres, and symbols of dominance. Any disruption, siege, betrayal, famine, could turn the world above into chaos, so the world below became the insurance policy. If attackers surrounded the castle, underground storage ensured survival. If rival nobles plotted treachery, hidden recesses kept valuables safe. If unexpected guests arrived with swords instead of calling cards, underground escape routes provided alternatives to dramatic last stands. Medieval people had a talent for imagining disaster, and their solution was usually to either dig deeper or build higher. Underground construction satisfied the dig deeper instinct very well. Additionally, medieval construction technology relied heavily on manpower and repetition, meaning digging was one of the few tasks that didn't require delicate craftsmanship. Carving out foundations employed unskilled labourers, prisoners, serfs, and anyone else who could hold a shovel and accept that sunlight was now a fond memory. While masons shaped stones above, armies of workers below cleared earth, shaped tunnels, and expanded cavities. The underground world wasn't planned in a modern architectural sense. It evolved, shaped by the needs of the moment, the realities of the terrain, and the limitless imagination of lords who kept saying, "What if we added another room?" Symbolism also mattered. A castle rising from the earth evoked strength, permanence, and divine authority. Building deep into the ground reinforced the message. This structure wasn't temporary. It wasn't merely placed on the land, it was of the land. Medieval chroniclers described great fortresses as if they were geological creatures, their roots in the soil and their towers touching the heavens. Subterranean spaces became part of that imagery, vaults representing protection, crypts representing lineage, and stone foundations representing eternity. You weren't just building for yourself, you were building for generations of descendants who would proudly inherit your property, debts, an ongoing feud with the family next door. Finally, medieval practicality, powered by equal parts ingenuity and we'll figure it out as we go, turned necessity into opportunity. As foundations were dug deeper and deeper, someone inevitably realised the underground world could become a second layer of the castle's life, a silent shadow realm supporting everything above. And so the subterranean blueprint began. Storage, stability, secrecy, survival. By the time the last stone was set, a castle was already living two lives, one in the sunlight, one in the depths. Long before a feast dazzled the great hall or a kitchen maid wept over a pot of something suspiciously moving, the true engine of castle survival quietly rested underground. Storage chambers. These were the first functional spaces carved into the earth after the foundations were secured, and they served as the medieval equivalent of a life support system. If the lord's wealth was displayed in glittering banners and pointed towers above, his real power was hidden below, in piles of grain, barrels of ale, and salted slabs of meat that could outlive a small war. Food didn't nourish you. It survived down here out of pure stubbornness. Every castle relied on these underground storage chambers because medieval life was essentially a seasonal gamble. Harvest determined hope, weather determined mood, and grain determined whether your winter ended with celebration or cannibalism rumours. The safest place to protect this precious food was beneath the earth, where temperature remained steady and thieves, unless extremely determined, preferred not to sneak through damp corridors for the privilege of stealing barley. Grain vaults were therefore carved out deliberately spacious, their walls lined with stone or clay and to keep moisture at bay. The trick was not simply storing food, but storing it in a way that made it usable months, sometimes years later. Medieval grain didn't have to taste good. It just had to avoid growing legs and walking away. But grain wasn't the only food that demanded attention. Castles required emergency food caches, deep chambers where supplies were tucked away specifically for sieges, famines, or moments when the lord made yet another impulsive political decision that angered half the kingdom. These caches were often hidden behind false walls or narrow passages, accessible only to trusted stewards. Their shelves carried hardtack that could break your teeth, dried beans shaped like pebbles, and smoked meats that had survived so much salting they were basically immortal. If food above ground was meant to impress, food stored underground was meant to endure. It was the culinary version of a long-term relationship, unglamorous, quietly dependable, and sometimes emotionally damaging. Salt rooms were another vital part of this subterranean ecosystem. Salt was medieval Europe's miracle ingredient, the closest thing they had to refrigeration, seasoning, and chemical wizardry rolled into one. These rooms were lined with wooden racks where cuts of meat and fish were layered with thick salt crystals. The salt pulled out moisture, prevented decay, and transformed fresh food into a hardened artifact that could survive a siege, a storm, or an unexpected visit from the in-laws. Walking into a salt room must have felt like entering a shrine dedicated to sodium and survival. If you were lucky, the meat was still vaguely recognisable. If not, well, it was still edible, probably. Cold pits, the medieval attempt at refrigeration, took underground ingenuity even further. Builders dug deep shafts into the ground, sometimes lined with straw, moss, or charcoal to maintain lower temperatures. In winter, ice or snow would be packed inside and covered, effectively turning the pit into a primitive freezer. Dairy, fruit, and other delicate foods were lowered inside using baskets and ropes, because nothing says delicious treat like hauling it up from a chilly medieval abyss. Of course, the system wasn't perfect. Ice melted, temperatures fluctuated, and occasionally a servant reached down for the cheese and discovered something that definitely wasn't cheese anymore. But for medieval standards, a cold pit was a technological marvel, even if the results were unpredictable enough to become a dinner-time gamble. Then there were wine cellars, which carried not just food but culture, ceremony and morale, especially during long winters when optimism froze faster than the moat. Wine, ale and mead all aged best underground, where the air stayed cool and steady year-round. Barrels lined the walls like slumbering giants, each containing enough liquid courage to soothe disputes, entertain guests, or help knights forget the fact that armour was a terrible fashion choice. These cellars were sometimes the largest underground rooms in a castle, cared for by cellarers who took their duties as seriously as priests guarding relics. A well-stocked cellar could maintain order, diplomacy and happiness. An empty one could spark a riot. Alcohol was, in many ways, the castle's unofficial peace treaty, but these chambers were more than storage. They were survival strategies shaped by necessity and fear. A single bad harvest, a poorly timed siege, or a prolonged winter could devastate a castle's population. Underground storage gave lords and commoners alike a buffer between life and starvation. The rooms were structured with meticulous care, raised floors to prevent dampness, ventilation shafts to discourage mould, drainage channels to redirect groundwater. Every detail reflected a world that knew nature was unpredictable and enemies were inevitable. Life above ground could seem grand, but beneath the stone lay the system that truly kept the castle functioning, a quiet, meticulous world where food fought against time and nature. And because medieval people believed in being prepared for absolutely everything, especially disaster, their underground layers continued to expand with new purposes. Every castle projected an image of invincible strength. Walls thick enough to laugh at catapults, towers tall enough to intimidate distant hills, and gates so reinforced they seemed carved out of stubbornness itself. But beneath all that bravado lurked a quiet truth. Medieval lords absolutely, unquestionably wanted a backup plan, and that backup plan was almost always a tunnel designed specifically for running away, medieval innovation at its finest. No matter how confidently a lord boasted about defending his stronghold to the last breath, he also wanted the option to sprint out this back door when things went horribly sideways. These secret escape tunnels were carved into the castle's underbelly from the earliest phases of construction, not as architectural flourishes, but as pure, undiluted self-preservation. Builders concealed entrances behind panels, inside fireplaces, beneath loose stones, and occasionally inside what looked like storage closets, but were actually gateways to medieval panic rooms. The entrances were deliberately narrow, often requiring the user to stoop, crouch, or crawl, which probably wasn't the triumphant exit anyone imagined, but when your choices are crawl in the dark or die dramatically, so suddenly stooping doesn't sound so bad. Trap floorways added an extra layer of theatrical flair. These weren't the Hollywood-style collapsible floors that send villains plunging into oblivion. Medieval trap floors usually concealed descending stairways or angled passages. Built into kitchens, private chambers, or guard rooms, they were designed for one very practical purpose: immediate disappearance. Many were activated manually, using hidden latches that blended into the surrounding stonework. Imagine being a medieval noble entertaining guests, hearing news of an invading army and saying, "Excuse me for a moment," before stepping onto a trapdoor and dropping out of the conversation entirely. Now that is commitment to an exit strategy. These tunnels were carefully aligned with the landscape. Medieval engineers didn't simply dig in a random direction and hope for the best, though it's possible some tried. Instead, they studied surrounding terrain to choose escape routes that offered concealment and strategic advantage. Some tunnels popped out in forests dense enough to hide a small procession. Others emerged near rivers, allowing fleeing nobles to board a waiting boat and look heroic while dramatically sailing away from their own castle. In coastal regions, Tunnels led directly to beaches or rocky coves ideal for clandestine departures, and when in doubt there was always a nearby monastery pause, because nothing disguised a fleeing noble quite like pretending to be suddenly overcome with religious devotion. But not all tunnels were purely for escape. Some doubled as smugglers' passages, allowing castle residents to move goods, letters, or highly inconvenient people without the watchful eyes of townsfolk or guards. These tunnels played roles in countless political intrigues, secret negotiations, illicit romances, midnight diplomacy, and the occasional, "Oops, we need to hide this person before someone notices." Because the entrances were so well hidden, only a trusted few ever knew their true locations. Secrets were currency, and in the medieval world, an escape tunnel was worth its weight in gold. The construction of these tunnels was no small feat. Digging underground passages through unpredictable soil and rock required skill, nerve, and an impressive tolerance for dampness. Tunneling teams reinforced the walls with timber or stone to prevent collapse, carved air shafts to allow breathing, and shaped exits so they blended seamlessly into the landscape. Some were hidden behind thick hedges or boulders, others disguised their openings as part of a riverbank or hillside. Medieval lords wanted to flee unseen, not emerge from a tunnel with a sign that said, "Secret exit, please don't block." Inside, the tunnels were often cramped, low-ceilinged, and uncomfortably humid. A fleeing noble might scrape elbows, bump their head, or discover that the ceiling dripped with mystery moisture. But at least the enemy wouldn't find them. Some tunnels were so long that they required resting alcoves where servants could catch their breath or nobles could reconsider the choices that led them here. And if the journey felt eerie, that was by design. The fewer people who enjoyed using these tunnels, the less likely they were to be misused. The irony, of course, is that many nobles loved to boast about how they would stand firm in battle, how their castle walls were unassailable, and how their enemies would never defeat them. Yet beneath those same walls lay a tunnel built solely for the purpose of escaping said enemies at high speed. Courage was admirable, survival was practical. And medieval survival strategies always leaned toward practicality, preferably practicality that involved sprinting through a dark corridor while hoping the exit wasn't accidentally sealed centuries ago. These secret tunnels also offered psychological reassurance. Knowing there was a hidden path to safety made ruling a little less terrifying. It was easier to manage a castle, negotiate hostile alliances, or aggravate neighbouring lords when you knew that if things went wrong, you could vanish like a dramatic smoke effect. The tunnels didn't just save lives, they emboldened decisions, for better or worse. In some cases, nobles may have been a little too confident knowing their escape route was waiting below. As time passed, many of these tunnels fell out of use, collapsed, or were forgotten entirely. Archaeologists occasionally discover them centuries later, and the findings can be surprising. Rusted hinges, torches fused to walls, collapsed beams, animal nests, or the kind of silence that suggests the tunnel has been waiting patiently for company since the 14th century. If food kept a medieval castle alive, would have kept it sane. Without a reliable supply of drinkable water, every grand hall, bustling kitchen and armed tower would collapse into panic faster than you could say, "We forgot to check the well again." Clean water was precious, unless the well was contaminated, in which case good luck and may the saints help your digestion. For medieval engineers and castle residents alike, ensuring access to safe water wasn't an afterthought. It was the difference between a triumphant defence and a very soggy, very embarrassing surrender. The first problem medieval builders faced was simple. Castles were typically built on high ground. It was perfect for spotting enemies, but terrible for reaching water. You can march an army up a hill, but water! Water has opinions. Water prefers low places. So engineers had to coax, trap, or harvest it in clever ways, and the safest solution, both strategically and stomach-wise, was a deep subterranean well dug straight into the castle's interior. These wells often descended astonishing distances, sometimes more than 50 metres, their stone-lined shafts stretching down into aquifers far below. Digging them wasn't just hard labour, it was a miracle of persistence, bravery, and perhaps a touch of masochism. Imagine lowering yourself into a dark, narrow shaft with nothing but a rope, a chisel, and the hope that the workers above were having a good day and not feeling accidentally clumsy. Once completed, these wells became the hidden lifeline of the castle. Buckets were lowered and raised on ropes that creaked ominously as if the castle itself was offering a warning. This water is precious. Spill it, and you're walking the long way down next time. Wells were placed in protected areas like courtyards or keeps, ensuring that, during sieges, residents could continue drawing water without exposing themselves to enemy arrows or insults shouted over the walls. A well inside the castle was like having your own secret stash of life insurance, specifically the kind that prevented dehydration and riots. But wells alone weren't always enough. Droughts happened, aquifers shifted, and sometimes the water table dipped lower than expected, leaving medieval residents staring down a very deep, very empty hole. Enter cisterns, enormous underground reservoirs carved beneath castles to collect and store rainwater. Roof channels and stone gutters funneled rainfall into these chambers, turning even a mild drizzle into an opportunity for celebration. Medieval people may not have enjoyed cold baths, but they deeply appreciated a rainy day when it meant their cisterns refilled. Cisterns were engineering masterpieces in their own right. Builders lined them with waterproof materials like pitch or clay, sealed them with stone vaults, and added filtration layers of gravel and sand to keep debris from turning the stored water into a floating buffet of leaves, feathers, and the occasional unlucky bug. The system wasn't perfect, of course. Openings needed to be protected from contamination, which medieval people attempted with lids, grates, and the sheer hope that no one would accidentally drop something important inside. Still, cisterns provided essential backup water when wells faltered, and during long sieges they became the difference between endurance and surrender. Water channels formed the final piece of the underground puzzle. These narrow passageways, carved below or behind castle walls, carried water from nearby springs, streams, or catchment points into the stronghold. Unlike wells, which provided vertical access, channels offered horizontal flow. To enemies outside, these channels were nearly invisible. To residents inside, they were a quiet miracle of design, providing water without requiring backbreaking manual hauling from distant sources. Some channels fed kitchens, others supplied washing areas, and a few were directed to specific rooms like garderobes to flush waste away. Medieval life may not have been hygienic by modern standards, but to people who weren't entirely oblivious, they understood that having water flowing in specific directions made life far more tolerable. But with every innovation came new risks. Wells could collapse, channels could clog, and cisterns could accidentally become home to creatures better suited to ponds than drinking water. Contamination was a constant threat. A dead animal falling into a well wasn't just a nuisance. It was a disaster, the kind that led to frantic prayers and a desperate search for alternative liquid sources. If water turned bad during a siege, the castle's downfall was essentially guaranteed. A handful of poisoned buckets could create chaos faster than an invading army. No wonder castle builders were paranoid about protecting their water systems. One mistake and suddenly everyone was fighting battles on two fronts, outside against the enemy and inside against whatever had decided to float in the drinking supply. Despite these challenges, medieval water systems were astonishing feats of engineering creativity. The people who designed them weren't working with modern tools or hydraulic models. They were guided by experience, observation, and the undeniable motivation that comes with knowing. Dehydration is an unpleasant way to lose a castle. Every bucket drawn from a well, every pitcher filled from a cistern, every ladle of clean water was the result of careful planning hidden beneath the surface. And now that our journey through the castle's essential waterworks is complete, we're ready to descend into darker places, the lower dungeon levels, where architecture, psychology, and medieval notions of justice blended into a subterranean world far more unsettling than any well or cistern. Long before refrigerators hummed politely in kitchens, medieval people waged a dramatic yearly battle with nature trying to convince winter to stick around just a little longer. Enter the ice house, a brilliant, bizarre, and only occasionally effective medieval attempt at refrigeration. On paper, the concept was genius. In practice, congratulations, you've invented refrigeration. Sort of, if it works, which it usually didn't. Ice houses, or underground ice pits, were carved into the earth with remarkable ambition. These weren't shallow ditches, but deep, wide chambers designed to store blocks of winter ice harvested from ponds, lakes, rivers, or anything else that froze hard enough to stand on without instantly regretting your life choices. Workers carved massive chunks from the surface, hauled them with sledges or carts, and lowered them into these subterranean vaults with the same reverence one might give sacred relics, because in a way, ice was sacred. It was cold in a world where cold usually meant hope it doesn't spoil before morning. The pits were insulated with a meticulous layering system. Straw, sawdust, reeds, or even charcoal were used to trap cold and slow the melting process. Builders understood that air was the enemy. Too much circulation robbed the chamber of precious chill, while too little caused stagnant moisture and mould. So they regulated airflow through narrow vents, balancing the delicate dance between preservation and humidity. It was early climate control, except the climate often ignored the memo. Inside these icy caverns, the stored blocks were stacked carefully, trimmed into shapes that fit together like frosty puzzle pieces. The tighter the fit, the longer they lasted. Workers stomped down layers of straw between the blocks, creating a surprisingly effective thermal barrier, assuming no rats decided the insulation was their personal theme park. Medieval people constantly battled nature, but rats were nature's most persistent interns. These ice houses served several purposes. Their most practical role was preserving food that otherwise spoiled faster than medieval optimism in a famine. Delicate meats, dairy, fruits, and even certain medicines were stored in the frigid air, dramatically extending their lifespan. For elite households, it was a mark of prestige to serve chilled delicacies in summer, sherbets, cool drinks, even early forms of iced desserts. Offering a guest something cold in July was the medieval equivalent of showing them you owned a private jet. It said, "Behold my wealth. Behold my resources. Also behold this cold wine that tastes slightly better than lukewarm wine." For all their prestige, ice houses were temperamental creatures. They relied entirely on the winter harvest, and if the season was too warm, too dry, too brief, or too chaotic, the entire year's supply could vanish. Imagine planning your summer feasts, your medical stores, and your preservation strategies, only for winter to shrug and say, "Not this year." Without ice, the pit was just a hole, an impressively dug hole, yes, but still a hole. Even when the harvest went well, tragedies happened. A poorly sealed vent could allow warm air to slip inside, transforming your carefully stacked ice into a puddle. A collapsed insulation layer could crush stored goods. Sometimes the ice melted too quickly, filling the pit with freezing water, which turned retrieving food into a medieval version of the world's bleakest fishing trip. And more than one unlucky servant returned to the ice house only to discover that the melted runoff had created something new, unsettling and aromatic in the depths. But when they worked, ice houses were magical. Castles could store fresh foods through spring and summer, giving residents access to ingredients unimaginable in lesser households. By controlling temperature, cooks could experiment with substances that required cooler environments, like creams, soft cheeses, and herbal preparations sensitive to heat. Medieval cuisine expanded its repertoire because someone had figured out that burying ice underground was a surprisingly effective way to tame nature, or at least negotiate with it. Ice houses also provided a fascinating glimpse into medieval scientific curiosity. Builders understood insulative layering long before they knew the physics behind it. They recognized the importance of shade, depth, and airflow. They even experimented with different materials to discover which combination preserved ice longest. While they didn't have thermometers or refrigeration theory, they observed, tested, and adjusted. It was empirical science at its most practical. driven by the universal human desire to keep food edible and drinks refreshing. Some castles developed even more elaborate cooling systems. They built double-walled chambers, used sloped floors to direct melted water away, or positioned the icehouse at the lowest point of the grounds to trap cold air. Others added above-ground domes, packed with layers of clay and earth, to shield the underground pit from summer heat. Although these enhancements varied wildly in success, they demonstrated a medieval willingness to innovate, even if the innovation involved digging a gigantic freezer into the earth and hoping the weather cooperated. Beyond their utility, ice houses became symbols of luxury. Only wealthier castles had the resources, labour force, and nearby water sources to harvest and store ice effectively. For many common folk, the idea of cold food in summer was fantasy. For the upper class, it was another way to showcase wealth and status. Ice was not just a tool, it was a spectacle. Yet even the finest icehouse couldn't guarantee perfect results. Summer heat was relentless, insulation imperfect, and the medieval world filled with enough unpredictable variables to keep everyone guessing. Using an icehouse was equal parts engineering, optimism, and crossed fingers. With refrigeration attempts covered, our descent into the castle's subterranean mysteries now takes a darker turn. Because just beneath the cooling chambers lay spaces far less refreshing. The lower dungeon levels, where medieval creativity met human dread in unforgettable ways. If the upper floors of a medieval castle were designed to impress, intimidate, and occasionally distract visiting nobles with lavish tapestries, the lowest levels existed for an entirely different purpose: to unsettle, punish, and quietly erase the people no one wanted to deal with. Beneath the bustling halls and warm hearth fires lay a world that medieval chroniclers rarely described in detail, not because it was unimportant, but because no one wanted to admit how far down the darkness truly went. Among these shadowed depths were lower dungeon tiers, isolation pits, and, most notorious of all, oubliettes. An oubliette, the perfect room for anyone you wanted to forget, including yourself. Unlike the better-known upper dungeons, where prisoners could at least sit upright and ponder their life choices, these lower levels were reserved for the unfortunate, the inconvenient, or the politically problematic. They were dug deep into the castle's foundations, often accessible only through narrow staircases that spiraled downward until the air grew colder and the stone walls seemed to close in from both sides. Down here, sound carried strangely. Footsteps echoed too long, and the torchlight flickered, as if reconsidering whether it wanted to accompany you any farther. The lower tiers were built for control, not comfort. Their architecture was functional and unforgiving. Cells were intentionally small, not to save space but to limit movement. Medieval captors understood that the mind could be punished even more effectively than the body. The darkness was near absolute. The only light came from torches carried by guards or from tiny slits carved into ceiling stones, allowing a thin thread of daylight to fall like divine mockery. For those held inside, time lost meaning quickly. Days blurred into nights, and nights blurred into something even less comforting. And then came the oubliettes, minimalist prisons in the worst possible sense. Unlike normal cells, an oubliette was accessible only from above. A trapdoor opened, someone unfortunate was lowered or simply dropped in, and the door sealed shut. The space below was often shaped like a bottle, wide at the bottom, narrow at the top, preventing the prisoner from climbing out. Some were entirely smooth stone, others had just enough unevenness to give false hope. And once you were inside, your first question was always the same: how long until someone remembers I'm here? The answer was usually, oh, they won't. Isolation pits took the psychological warfare even further. These were small chambers with no openings at all, no barred windows, no cracks for light, sometimes not even a proper door, just a stone slab wedged tightly into place. The purpose wasn't merely imprisonment, it was sensory deprivation centuries before anyone had coined a term for it. In pitch darkness, sound muffled, air stale and unmoving, prisoners experienced an overwhelming sense of disorientation. Many emerged days or weeks later unsure if the world above was real or merely imagined. Others emerged changed in ways medieval guards noted with a shudder and a promise to themselves never to speak of the pit again. It wasn't just criminals who ended up here. Nobles who fell out of favour, political rivals awaiting ransom negotiations, spies, traitors, and occasionally family members who had become inconvenient were all candidates for the lower levels. In some regions, castle owners kept private prisoners, individuals held secretly, their existence unrecorded, their fates known only to the Lord and a handful of loyal servants. Records of these captives were often destroyed or never written at all, which is why archaeologists sometimes find traces of human presence in forgotten corners of castles with no accompanying explanation. Medieval history is full of loud events, but its silence often hides the strangest truths. The conditions in these lower dungeons varied widely depending on the jailer's intent. Some prisoners received food, water, and occasional human contact. Others received little more than darkness and the hope that the next bucket lowered through the opening contained something drinkable. A few oubliettes were even used temporarily, holding prisoners until negotiations were concluded or tempers cooled. But the most infamous ones, they held people for months, years, or until a guard decades later said, "Why does this hinge feel a little loose?" and discovered a secret of the castle better left undisturbed. Architecture played a crucial role in enhancing the psychological strain. Sound carried in strange ways through stone. In some dungeons, a whisper from one cell could echo down the corridor to another, creating the eerie illusion of voices coming from nowhere. Dripping water, shifting stones, and the distant rumble of life happening above, these became the soundtrack of imprisonment. Some lower tiers even amplified footsteps from upper levels, making it sound as though someone, or something, was pacing directly overhead. Whether intentional or accidental, these effects fed into the growing dread of those trapped below. Guards rarely stayed long in these regions. They preferred the upper floors where daylight existed, and emotional stability was more or less possible. Many used torches or candles even in areas where light filtered through, simply to feel they weren't alone. Some castles had informal rules forbidding guards from descending alone. Others rotated dungeon duty to avoid the unsettling effects that prolonged exposure had on their minds. Even those who never descended swore the castle breathed at night, its lower levels shifting or sighing as if remembering those buried within. These forgotten tiers weren't just prisons, they were statements, reminders that authority extended not only upward in grandeur, but downward into fear. Castles projected power through towers and battlements, but their true ability to control lay in the threat of the darkness below. And like all effective threats, it remained mostly unseen. If the Great Hall represented a castle's pride, and the dungeons represented its fear, then the hidden armories beneath the stone were its heartbeat, silent, cold, and always ready for trouble. These buried chambers held a kingdom's insurance policy. Spears stacked like lethal forests, arrow crates packed tighter than a medieval accountant's ledger, and armour sets waiting patiently for the day someone shouted, "We're under attack!" because nothing says relaxing home like a basement full of pointy things. Unlike the grand armories displayed above ground, where polished helms and ceremonial swords gleamed for visitors, the subterranean caches were strictly practical. This was the real arsenal, the one you didn't show off, the one meant to stay operational even when the castle was surrounded, sabotaged, or otherwise one insult away from disaster. These chambers were usually hidden deeper than any storeroom, positioned in out-of-the-way corridors, behind false walls, or down staircases so narrow you wondered whether medieval designers simply hated shoulders. Inside, organisation was everything. Anyone who's ever fought a battle knows you don't want to rummage for a weapon like you're searching for lost keys. Spears were bundled and tied against walls in thick sheaves. The bundles allowed defenders to arm dozens of soldiers in moments. These spears weren't decorative, they were made to last, their shafts hardened, their tips kept sharp through maintenance routines that probably felt more like chores than heroism. Even when unused for years, They were ready the moment someone outside began yelling in a tone that suggested trouble. Arrow caches were particularly impressive. Stored in wooden crates sealed to keep out moisture, rats, and overly curious squires, they were arranged to provide maximum accessibility. Arrows were the medieval version of ammunition, and running out mid-siege was the kind of mistake storytellers loved to criticize centuries later. So castles stored thousands of them, sometimes tens of thousands, all hidden away underground where neither attackers nor weather could interfere. Opening one of these crates must have been oddly satisfying. Rows of perfectly fletched shafts lined up like disciplined soldiers, each one promising to deliver a message that said go bother someone else. Armour sets formed the backbone of these caches. They weren't the ornate jewel-studded suits worn by nobles during parades. These were utilitarian harnesses forged for battlefield use. Helmets, breastplates, gauntlets, and shields were stacked or hung with methodical precision, sized for average soldiers, because medieval defence was less about individual glamour and more about collective survival. A knight might fight in his own personalised armour, but the garrison relied on whatever was stored below. These hidden armories allowed a castle to mobilise quickly, equipping household guards, militia forces, and sometimes even terrified cooks who suddenly found themselves drafted into emergency service. The placement of these caches was strategic. Builders tucked them deep enough to be secure, but close enough to defensive stations that weapons could be carried upstairs in minutes. Some armories had multiple exits, allowing defenders to distribute equipment to different sections of the castle without bottlenecking at a single staircase. In a well-designed stronghold, you could arm a full contingent faster than an invading force could say, "Oops, they were prepared." Ventilation mattered too. Metal stored in damp, stale air corrodes faster than medieval hope during a plague year. So designers carved narrow vents into the walls, creating airflow systems that kept moisture at bay. It wasn't perfect, nothing underground ever was, but it meant that when the time came to don armour, you weren't slipping into something half-rotted. You were putting on metal that still had a fighting chance at protecting you, but the hidden armories weren't just about weapons. They held tools for siege defence, replacement bowstrings, shield blanks, spearheads, hammer sets, spare chainmail rings, and the ubiquitous barrels of pitch or oil used to greet unwelcome guests from the battlements. Some chambers even included repair stations, simple benches stocked with tools for emergency mending. A torn gambeson or dented helmet could be patched enough to buy a soldier a few more precious minutes of survival. Not all underground caches served purely defensive roles. Some stored items meant to be used offensively if a daring sortie or nighttime raid became necessary. Quiet weapons, daggers, short swords, and padded shields rested in deeper compartments. These weren't the clattering, armour-heavy tools used for frontline clashes. They were designed for stealth, allowing small teams to move silently through darkness, whether slipping out of secret exits or ambushing intruders who somehow made it inside. Of course, any chamber filled with sharp objects carried risks. A poorly placed step, a dropped torch, or one clumsy guard could turn the armoury into a medieval slapstick tragedy. Records occasionally mention accidents here, the kind politely summarised as mishaps in the lower armoury, which almost certainly meant someone had been too enthusiastic around the spears. Yet despite these hazards, the caches remained essential. They weren't glamorous, but they ensured readiness, discipline, and the comforting feeling that somewhere beneath your feet lay enough sharp metal to discourage even the boldest enemy. These armories also reflected a universal medieval truth. Peace was temporary, but preparation was permanent. Castles could go years without facing a threat, but no garrison commander wanted to explain to their lord that they'd run out of arrows on day one of a siege. Better to be over-prepared than underarmed, especially when the alternative involved unpleasant negotiations with people holding battering rams. In the medieval world, nothing glittered quite like power, and nothing symbolised power quite like gold. But gold had one stubborn flaw. Everyone wanted it. Thieves wanted it. Rivals wanted it. Armies wanted it. Even governments occasionally wanted it back, usually with a polite note attached that said, We're raising taxes again. So nobles did what nobles always do when someone eyes their wealth a little too eagerly. They buried it underground. Secret treasury vaults became the silent, stone-lined piggy banks of the medieval world, hidden so effectively that even the nobility sometimes forgot where they put them. Gold doesn't spoil, but nobles tended to, especially when they couldn't find it again. These vaults weren't the wide, glittering chambers you see in fantasy films. Most were tight, compact rooms nestled deep beneath the castle's floors, accessible only by the narrow staircases, twisting passages, or trapdoors disguised as normal stone slabs. The goal was simple: make the vaults so inconvenient to reach that only someone who really needed to be there would bother. Medieval nobles preferred security by inconvenience, a system that has survived into modern bureaucracy. The walls of these vaults were built with obsessive precision. Unlike dungeons or storage chambers, treasury rooms were reinforced with thicker, denser stone blocks. Some castles used double-layered walls, an inner stone chamber tucked inside an outer shell, leaving a thin air gap that acted as a primitive impact buffer. If someone tried to break in, they had to break through 2 rooms before reaching even a single coin. Medieval engineers called this clever design. Modern observers might call it anxious hoarding. The contents of a noble treasury varied widely. Coins were the foundation, stacks of silver pennies, gold florins, hammered coins bearing the faces of monarchs whose heads were often more valuable than their policies. Each coin represented labour, land, or loyalty, preserved in a form small enough to lose between floorboards if someone sneezed too hard. Nobles counted, weighed, and stored their currency in sturdy chests bound with iron straps. And because medieval craftsmanship had its quirks, no 2 chests ever opened the same way, ensuring at least one servant swore loudly during inventory season. But coins were only the beginning. Noble hoards brimmed with ceremonial valuables intended for display on special occasions: coronets, gilded armour pieces, embroidered banners, jewelled goblets, relic containers, silver platters, and the occasional object whose purpose had been long forgotten but was definitely expensive. These items weren't meant for daily use, they were political tools. A well-timed display of glittering wealth could sway negotiations, intimidate rivals, or convince guests that your castle was less drafty than it felt. During times of war, these ceremonial pieces vanished underground, hidden away until peace returned. Not because nobles were afraid to lose them, though they certainly were, but because captured treasure often funded enemy armies. Nothing stings quite like realizing your stolen silverware helped finance the siege currently happening outside your window. Some vaults stored objects of spiritual significance. Reliquaries, blessed vessels, and ornate manuscripts were tucked away for safekeeping during invasions. Monasteries often faced fewer attacks than castles, but nobles weren't inclined to trust anyone, not monks, not allies, not even their own future selves. Many a lord buried relics with such enthusiasm that later generations found them centuries afterward and said, "Fascinating discovery," while ignoring the faint sound of long-dead nobles screaming, "I was saving that!" Of course, secrecy was everything. Treasury vaults had multiple layers of protection. Heavy doors reinforced with iron kept out intruders, while locking mechanisms ranged from the straightforward to the delightfully confusing. Some used oversized keys kept on the lord's belt. Others required combinations of levers or rotating stones. One misaligned block, and you weren't opening that door again without divine intervention or a very enthusiastic blacksmith. Servants who knew the vault's location were chosen carefully, often bound by oath, loyalty, or the unspoken understanding that their continued employment depended on never saying, "Guess what I found underground?" Access was restricted even during calm times. Inventories were conducted under tight supervision, and chests were sometimes sealed with wax to ensure nobody took an unauthorized souvenir. But for all this meticulous secrecy, vaults still went missing. Renovations shifted walls, fires destroyed records, successive generations failed to pass along key information, and so, hidden beneath some ancient castles, there are almost certainly still chambers filled with forgotten wealth. Archaeologists occasionally stumble upon one, a silent room sealed for centuries, dust coating untouched coins, preserved as if waiting for the noble who will never return. These vaults weren't simply financial storage, they were emotional storage as well. Nobles poured their anxieties, ambitions and dreams into those buried chambers. Wealth represented the ability to survive war, fund alliances, repair damage and maintain status. Losing it wasn't just inconvenient, it was existential. A treasury vault was a noble's safety net against the unpredictable chaos of medieval life. And so, beneath every castle tower and tapestry, beneath every feast and festival, a quiet chamber waited in the dark, not for celebration, but for crisis. Wealth wasn't meant to shine, it was meant to endure, hidden away until the day it was needed. With the treasures secured underground, we now move toward a far less glamorous and significantly more fragrant aspect of castle life. The subterranean sewer systems, where waste and engineering collided in ways both necessary and unforgettable. If medieval castles had a forbidden underworld, it wasn't the dungeons, the treasure vaults, or the secret tunnels. It was the sewer system, a network of drainage tunnels, waste shafts, and cesspits that kept the castle functioning, while ensuring no one talked about it at dinner. The good news, waste goes down. The bad news, so does the smell. Forever. In a world built on stone, sweat and survival, nothing was quite as unglamorous yet absolutely essential as the medieval sewer. Contrary to the popular myth that castles simply let waste fall wherever it pleased, many fortresses had surprisingly sophisticated systems for managing it. Not pleasant, mind you, medieval sewage was never pleasant, but functional. Builders understood that if you lived with dozens or hundreds of people inside a walled space without some sort of waste management, the result would be a biological situation that even the bravest knight wouldn't battle. So they carved tunnels beneath the castle, angled channels, dug catch basins, and positioned waste shafts with careful, if not compassionate, strategy. The guardrobes, medieval latrines, were integral to this system. Built along outer walls or above flowing water, they ranged from narrow nooks behind wooden doors to larger communal spaces that made privacy a myth. Waste dropped through vertical shafts carved directly through the stone. These shafts emptied into cesspits, stagnant pools, or drainage tunnels that carried everything downhill, away from the castle's living quarters and, ideally, away from its nose. Ideally being the operative word. Medieval engineering excelled at many things, but controlling smell was not among them. The cesspit was the castle's unsung horror. Often dug deep underground and lined with stone or timber, it served as the final resting place for everything the guards, nobles, cooks, servants, and occasional terrified guests deposited into the guardrobe system. As pits filled, they needed to be emptied. Who performed this unenviable chore? Professional cleaners, often known as gong farmers, whose entire career consisted of descending into pits of waste with buckets, scraping sludge from stone walls, and emerging with a smell so persistent it could have been classified as a form of supernatural haunting. They worked at night, not for secrecy, but because the summer sun turned cesspits into chemical experiments no one wished to inhale during daylight hours. Not all waste fell into pits. Drainage tunnels carried a combination of rainwater, kitchen runoff, spilled ale, laundry remnants, and everything else that didn't belong above ground. These narrow channels snaked beneath courtyards and kitchens, sloping downward to eventually expel their contents into nearby streams or moats. This meant the moat, while visually dramatic, was also a liquid time capsule of everything the castle didn't want anymore. If you fell into a moat, your biggest concern wasn't drowning, it was what you were drowning in. Because these systems were underground, maintenance was difficult. Tunnels clogged, shafts cracked, and pests thrived in the damp, nutrient-rich darkness. Rats scampered through the sewage network like tiny lords of the underrealm, fat on medieval leftovers and unaware that centuries later they'd be blamed for every plague ever. Insects flourished. Odours seeped into cracks in the stone. A well-placed reed mat or tapestry might hide the worst of the smell in living quarters, but nothing could fully erase the underlying scent of a castle doing its biological best. Some castles did try to innovate. A few positioned guardrobes over rivers to allow flowing water to carry waste away, the medieval version of flush and forget. Others introduced lime to cesspits to reduce the stench and encourage decomposition. A few, in moments of architectural optimism, built angled shafts that encouraged airflow to whisk unpleasant gases upward and away. Naturally, these systems worked beautifully on parchment diagrams and rarely as well in real life. Airflow, like medieval water, had opinions. Despite its grim nature, the sewer system reflected thoughtful engineering. Builders used gravity as their main ally. Waste flowed downward because pushing it upward was both impossible and, frankly, insulting to physics. Drainage channels followed the natural contours of the land, allowing rainwater to sweep debris away. Even the layout of guardrobes was strategic, placed near kitchens, barracks, and guest rooms so no one had to walk a quarter-mile to answer nature's call, which could be dangerous at night given medieval lighting consisted mostly of hope and fire. But the smell shaped daily life more than anyone admitted. Castle residents developed robust tolerance levels. Visitors sometimes described the odour as strong, earthy, or befitting a fortress of war, which is medieval politeness for "my nose may never recover." Even nobles accustomed to luxury could not escape it. Their chambers might have wall hangings and cushions, but somewhere beneath their feet the underworld continued its eternal aromatic labour. And then there was the psychological effect. Knowing that beneath every comfortable room was a network of tunnels carrying waste to mysterious depths gave the castle a dual identity. Majestic above, chaotic below. Residents walked floors supported by stone arches that separated them from a churning, unseen world of sewage. If they thought about it too long, the castle suddenly felt less like a palace and more like a multi-storey compromise with nature. Yet despite its unpleasantness, the sewer system was as vital as any tower or battlement. Without it, disease would spread, morale would plummet, and the castle would become uninhabitable. The dark underworld no one wanted to inherit was, ironically, the one thing that allowed life above to flourish. With waste safely transported to its murky destinations, we now move from the sewer's earthy realism to an unexpected twist in the underground design. The subterranean quarters built specifically for animals, an unusual but surprisingly practical feature of some medieval castles. In the medieval world, animals were more than companions. They were engines, alarms, transportation, heating systems, and, on unfortunate occasions, dinner. Castles depended on them as much as they depended on stone walls or well-trained soldiers. Which is why some fortresses made the unexpected choice to bury their stables, kennels, or animal storage rooms beneath ground level. To the modern mind, this may sound questionable. To the medieval mind, it was a masterpiece of practicality. Keeping animals underground, the smell was a medieval experience. Why sink animals below the surface in the first place? The most important reason was protection. Castles were often placed in regions where raids, sieges, and surprise attacks were as common as unwanted visitors during festival season. Horses, hunting dogs, messenger animals, and livestock represented wealth, mobile, edible, or militarily significant wealth. Leaving them exposed in the courtyard was an invitation to thieves or enemy archers. Bringing them underground gave them shelter from arrows, weather, and opportunistic hands. For a lord who valued mobility, losing horses was not merely inconvenient, it was catastrophic. Temperature control was another consideration. Medieval winters could be bitter, especially in northern regions. Stone walls kept castles cold enough, but underground chambers remained relatively stable year-round. Horses stabled above ground might shiver through winter nights. Horses kept below experienced a more consistent climate, their heat lingering in the enclosed space. It wasn't luxury, but medieval expectations of comfort applied mostly to nobles, not animals. Warmth mattered, and even if the trade-off was aroma, and aroma there was. Underground kennels occupied an awkward place in castle life. On one hand, dogs were essential for hunting, guarding, and occasionally chasing away suspicious guests. On the other, keeping them in subterranean halls meant barking reverberated through stone corridors like the world's angriest echo chamber. Imagine being a servant trying to sleep 2 floors up while 12 enthusiastic hounds practiced their nightly, alert the entire castle routine. Still, this arrangement protected the animals, and to medieval ears, barking was just another castle soundscape right alongside clanging armour and someone shouting about spilled ale. Ventilation became an engineering necessity. Builders carved narrow slits, hidden shafts or angled vents to bring fresh air down and usher stale air out, though fresh was a relative concept. These ducts helped channel heat upward and carried animal odours away from living quarters, not always successfully. Medieval architects tried their best. But there's only so much you can do when you place a family of goats in an underground room and say, "Please don't smell too goat-like." Yet goats, sheep and pigs were sometimes kept in these spaces, especially during sieges. If the castle was surrounded, there could be no safe grazing outside the walls. Underground animal storage rooms became emergency food reserves, living stock that stayed protected until absolutely needed. It was a grim reality, but so was siege life. Better to hear the muffled bleating of future meals than to starve. Horses, naturally, were the most prized residents of underground stables. To accommodate their size and needs, these chambers were larger, arched and reinforced. Builders placed feeding troughs, water basins, and straw bedding carefully. They carved broad ramps to allow horses to enter and exit without slipping, and they installed drainage channels to manage the constant river of horse contributions that flowed across stable floors. The system wasn't perfect, but it worked, and above all, it kept the animals safe. There were also strategic uses for underground kennels and stables. During nighttime ambushes, dogs kept in lower chambers could hear movement from outside through the stone walls, alerting guards long before enemies reached the gates. Their senses extended the castle's awareness. Horses stabled below could be quietly prepared before dawn raids or emergency evacuations. Their hooves, muffled by stone, revealed nothing to prying ears. The underground became a tactical advantage, a place where mobility could be maintained in absolute secrecy. These animal rooms often doubled as storage spaces for supplies, fodder, harnesses, saddles, warming blankets, and equipment needed for long journeys or military engagements. Keeping everything underground protected it from rain, mould, and the occasional bird determined to ruin someone's day. It also kept gear conveniently close to the animals, creating an efficient cycle of feeding, grooming, and preparation. But living above these underground menageries came with quirks. Residents occasionally complained that the floors vibrated faintly when horses shifted below. In winter, some rooms grew slightly warmer thanks to the cumulative heat rising from the animals, an unintended but welcome bonus. In other areas, strange smells seeped up through cracks in the stone, leaving servants to wonder whether the kitchen had burned something, or whether the goats were simply protesting their architectural imprisonment. Over time, many of these chambers fell out of use. As warfare evolved and castle life changed, animals moved above ground into more open stables or farm buildings. Subterranean spaces either collapsed, filled with debris, or were repurposed into storerooms. Today, archaeologists crawling through forgotten tunnels sometimes stumble upon worn troughs, hoof-scuffed floors, or rusted fittings that hint at a bustling underground stable life long vanished. Still, the purpose remains clear. The medieval castle was not just a fortress, but a functioning ecosystem, and animals were part of that ecosystem, creatures worth protecting, feeding, and using wisely. Keeping them underground wasn't odd to medieval minds. It was sensible, even ingenious. With animals fed, sheltered, and occasionally contributing to castle ambience through sound and smell, our journey now shifts toward another hidden realm beneath the stone. The secret servant corridors and unseen routes, where the real machinery of castle life operated quietly out of sight. If nobles were the visible face of castle life, servants were the invisible engine, constantly moving, constantly working, and ideally not seen or heard unless absolutely necessary. But how do you keep dozens of people bustling around a stone fortress without letting them interrupt the elegant illusion of noble tranquility? Simple. You build an entire shadow world beneath the floors. The good news? You have privacy. The bad news? Someone has been walking under your floorboards all day. These subterranean servant corridors were not luxuries. They were logistical necessities, carved into the castle's lower levels to keep work flowing smoothly and discreetly. Nobles preferred their meals to arrive as if conjured by magic, steaming, perfectly timed, and with absolutely no visual evidence of the frantic human activity required to get it there. Servants darting through grand halls disrupted the aesthetic, and nothing ruined the mood of a diplomatic feast like watching someone sprint past carrying a stack of trenchers. So architects designed a concealed world of connecting tunnels, narrow stairways, and basement walkways to move labour out of sight and out of mind. These passages formed a maze-like network. Some were broad enough for carts carrying firewood or large barrels. Others were tight corridors barely wide enough for a single person to squeeze through sideways while carrying laundry buckets or a tray of bread dough that threatened uprising. The walls were plain, the ceilings low, and the air always cooler than the bustling rooms above. These weren't meant to impress. They were meant to function. The tunnels connected everything important. The kitchens to the great hall, the pantries to the storage rooms, the guards' quarters to the battlements, and the workshops to the service entrances. A servant could traverse half the castle without ever emerging into public view. To the nobility, daily life seemed calm, orderly, and elegant. To the servants below, it was a daily marathon navigated by memory, instinct, and the hope that no one dropped something heavy down a staircase. Lighting these corridors was an ongoing challenge. Torches burned out, candles were expensive, and sunlight rarely reached subterranean levels. Some tunnels had small ventilation shafts that allowed a bit of light to trickle in, but most remained dim throughout the day. Servants memorized every turn, every uneven stone, and every low-hanging ceiling beam. New workers learned quickly, usually after hitting their head once and earning the unofficial badge of underground initiation. One of the strangest sensations in a castle was hearing faint footsteps or murmuring voices beneath your feet without seeing a single person. For nobles visiting from other regions, this was unsettling. For residents, it was as normal as hearing the wind in the battlements or the clatter of horses in the courtyard. Life carried on quietly below, reacting to every need of the people above with the efficiency of an unseen hive. But this hidden world wasn't only for daily tasks. During emergencies, these passages became vital escape or redistribution routes. Servants could deliver messages, move weapons, or guide important individuals to safety without drawing attention. The tunnels also allowed staff to travel between dangerous exterior points, such as outer kitchens or workshops, and the inner keep without risking ambush. When attackers breached outer walls, servants used these discreet channels to flee inward, locking doors behind them and slowing enemy progress. Despite their utility, underground corridors were physically taxing. They were hot in summer, freezing in winter, and perpetually filled with drafts. Moisture seeped through stone, creating slick patches on the floor and making quick travel slightly perilous. The smell varied depending on proximity to workshops, storerooms, or the kitchen's ever-active hearth. Some corridors echoed with clattering pots, others with the grinding rhythm of mill wheels or the metallic ring of smithing. Just following the sounds could guide a servant through the labyrinth, a living map of noise and familiarity. Servants also developed a unique social culture within these hidden routes. Down here they shared gossip, warnings, jokes, secrets, and the occasional conspiracy about the noble family's latest baffling decision. The tunnels became the bloodstream of castle communication, not formal announcements, but the real talk. Who was ill, which feast was running behind schedule, what ingredient had run out, and which knight had once again misplaced his boots. In many ways, castle order depended on this subterranean social network just as much as it depended on walls and weapons. Some areas served as small rest stations, simple alcoves with stools or benches where servants paused for a moment before rushing on. In the heat of major events, like banquets or festivals, these quiet corners became crowded hubs of coordination. Servants balanced trays, exchanged quick instructions, and vanished again into the stone arteries of the castle, before anyone above knew they were there. The architecture itself reflected the divide between upstairs and downstairs life. Floors were often thicker in noble areas, muffling the movement below. Soundproofing wasn't perfect, though, so occasionally a lord in deep conversation would pause and frown at a faint clatter, wondering if the castle was haunted by extremely industrious ghosts. Meanwhile, servants learned exactly where stepping lightly mattered, and where heavy footfalls wouldn't interrupt someone's afternoon nap. Over centuries, some of these passages collapsed or were sealed off, leaving archaeologists puzzled by odd walls, dead-end staircases, or bricked-in chambers. Others survived intact, dusty time capsules of worn steps, soot-stained ceilings, and abandoned tools. Exploring them today feels like stepping into the castle's subconscious, the part that kept everything running while pretending it didn't exist. With the servant world uncovered, our journey beneath the castle now turns towards something even older and more symbolic. The subterranean chapel crypts and hidden religious chambers where ancestors' relics and rituals quietly shaped the spiritual heartbeat of medieval fortress life. Beneath the soaring arches and stained glass reverence of a castle chapel lingered something quieter, older, and far more intimate, the crypt. These buried sanctuaries form the spiritual backbone of castle life, a shaded realm where prayer mixed with memory and stone cradled centuries of devotion. Whether used for worship, burial, or the safekeeping of relics, these subterranean spaces spoke to a medieval truth. Faith did not stay politely above ground. It reached downward into the cold earth. Nothing deepens your spiritual reflection like standing on 100 years of ancestors. Crypts were among the earliest components of castle chapels, often constructed before the upper sanctuary was even complete. Builders carved chambers directly into the earth, or integrated them beneath raised flooring, placing the foundations of faith literally on top of the past. Their architecture was deliberate: low-vaulted ceilings, thick pillars, and narrow passageways that encouraged silence and humility. No grand displays, no gilded altars, just stone shadows and the feeling that every footstep echoed into history. Many crypts house noble burial sites. The medieval elite believed proximity to sacred spaces improved their spiritual prospects. So being interred beneath the chapel, the holiest site within a castle, was the ultimate privilege. Sarcophagi or stone slabs lined the chambers, carved with symbols of lineage, knighthood or piety. Some tombs bore effigies, their sculpted faces gazing upward in eternal prayer or stoic resignation, depending on how generous the sculptor felt. In death, nobles hoped to be remembered. Crypts ensured their presence endured even when memory faded. But crypts were not merely grave sites. They often doubled as small chapels where clergy or devout servants conducted private worship away from the bustle above. Flickering candlelight illuminated carved crosses, painted icons, or simple stone altars. The air carried a stillness that made prayer feel heavier, as though the walls themselves listened. For weary castle residents, descending into the crypt meant stepping away from politics, chores, and the never-ending hunt for clean water. Down here, the noise of medieval life dissolved into quiet reverence. Many castles also hosted secret religious chambers. These hidden rooms weren't for illicit cults or conspiracies, though a few rumours suggested otherwise. They were practical, created for moments when worship needed to be discreet. Visiting clergy might perform rites for sick nobles, strategists might take oaths before battle, soldiers might confess fears before manning the walls. Small as they were, these spaces provided spiritual refuge at times when the chapel above was crowded, or the situation too sensitive for public eyes. Then there were the relic vaults, subterranean rooms reserved for storing sacred objects believed to possess divine power or historical significance. medieval faith was deeply intertwined with relics. Bones of saints, fragments of holy cloth, or even splinters claimed to be from the true cross were kept in ornate caskets. These items were locked away not because they were doubted, but because they were priceless and vulnerable. A stolen relic could cause not only spiritual crisis but diplomatic catastrophe. Vaults protected these treasures from thieves, fire, political upheaval, or the slightly embarrassing possibility that a visiting bishop might ask to see the relic you misplaced 2 years ago. Vault design leaned toward the austere but secure. Heavy stone doors, iron locking mechanisms, and narrow entrances deterred unauthorized access. Some vaults had carved inscriptions, religious verses, warnings, or simply the names of donors who wanted future generations to know they contributed something other than polite complaints. The relics themselves rested in chests or shrines lined with fabric, not for comfort, but to shield them from humidity and dust. Medieval people didn't fully understand preservation science, but they did understand reverence. Symbolism permeated these underground religious spaces. Descending into a crypt mirrored theological themes of humility, penance, and rebirth. Burial beneath the chapel suggested continuity between the living and the dead. Relic vaults embodied protection of the sacred. Hidden chapels emphasized that faith could survive even in moments of secrecy or danger. For medieval people, holiness was not confined to sunlight. It dwelled in stone recesses lit only by candles, in whispered prayers, and in the quiet company of the departed. The crypts also reflected the realities of castle life. Conflict could erupt at any moment, and relics, clergy, and noble remains needed safeguarding. During sieges, crypts sometimes served as makeshift shelters for clergy, or as emergency chapels when the upper sanctuary became unsafe. They also housed critical documents, marriage records, genealogy lists, land deeds, items that held both spiritual and political weight. If the castle fell, these records could define who held claims to what land, shifting power in ways armies alone couldn't manage. Yet for all their solemn purpose, crypts were not immune to human quirks. Some nobles insisted on extravagant tombs that barely fit through the narrow crypt entrances, causing workmen to curse softly while manoeuvring elaborate stone coffins. Others requested to be buried near favoured relatives, resulting in crypt layouts that resembled complicated family seating arrangements. And every so often, a servant reported hearing unexplained noises below, whispers, footsteps, or the creak of stone, likely caused by drafts or shifting foundations, but eagerly attributed to ancestors uncomfortable with their eternal neighbours. Over time, many crypts fell out of use. Some were sealed as burial practices changed, others filled with dust and forgotten artefacts, waiting centuries to be rediscovered. Archaeologists entering these spaces today find a haunting silence, broken only by the faint echo of their footsteps, the same echo medieval worshippers heard long ago. With the spiritual heart of the castle explored, we now rise toward a realm where faith met curiosity, and curiosity sometimes met trouble. The alchemist workshops and hidden laboratories that bubbled, smoked, and occasionally exploded in the shadows beneath medieval strongholds. If medieval castles had a place where curiosity, ambition, and mild explosions all came together, it was the alchemist's cellar. Hidden deep beneath the stone foundations, these dark rooms hosted a world that existed somewhere between science, superstition, and, please don't touch that, it might be poisonous. Nobles tolerated at these workshops for the same reason they tolerated eccentric uncles. They were unpredictable, occasionally useful, and best kept out of sight. Is it science? Is it sorcery? Is it just someone making questionable potions? Yes. Alchemists were the medieval world's proto-scientists, driven by the belief that nature's secrets could be unlocked with enough heat, patience, and trial and error, bordering on hazardous. They sought everything from medicinal cures to eternal life, from transmutation of metals to recipes for powders that burned brighter than common fire. Castles with intellectual or ambitious lords often included hidden basement rooms specifically for these pursuits, partly to facilitate study, and partly to ensure no one accidentally set the Great Hall on fire. These rooms were deliberately isolated. The combination of open flames, bubbling concoctions, and fumes of unknown origin made alchemist workshops a danger to anyone who valued long-term respiratory health. Thick stone walls helped contain accidents, of which there were many. Medieval chroniclers rarely wrote about these mishaps de rare. But records of sudden holes in ceilings or servants requesting transfers to anywhere else, please, tell their own story. A good workshop was a sturdy workshop. Anything less risked becoming an unexpected skylight. Inside, the rooms were cluttered with tools that looked halfway between kitchen utensils and instruments of interrogation. Crucibles, retorts, alembics, glass vials, iron tongs, mortars and pestles, all scattered across wooden tables stained with previous experiments. Shelves bowed under the weight of jars containing herbs, minerals, animal parts, and substances whose labels range from cryptic symbols to vague titles like Dragon's Breath or The Good Powder. Whether the alchemist actually knew what half these things were is a matter of debate, but they certainly acted like they did. Fire was central to alchemical work. Small furnaces glowed constantly, fed by charcoal and controlled with bellows. Apprentices spent hours maintaining temperatures, adjusting vents, and praying that nothing boiled over. The mix of flickering flame and chemical vapours created a room thick with shadows and scents, some sharp, some earthy, some that made anyone wandering past ask, "Is something dying in there?" The answer was usually no, but it might be soon. Alchemists weren't the only inhabitants of these secret cellars. Healers also worked underground, distilling tinctures and preparing remedies away from the contamination of busy kitchens or drafty upper floors. These healers were practical experimenters, testing combinations of plants, oils, resins, and minerals. Some preparations eased pain or reduced fever. Others caused reactions so alarming they were quietly buried in the courtyard under the cover of darkness. Still, every breakthrough, even accidental ones, gave medieval medicine another step forward. Then there were the people whose activities straddled the line between permitted and frowned upon. Herbalists working with forbidden plants, astrologers drawing charts by candlelight, fortune-tellers reading patterns in smoke, scholars studying texts considered too strange for public view. These cellars became havens for intellectual pursuits deemed risky or unorthodox. Nobles might publicly dismiss such studies, but privately, they always had questions. Will I win this war? Should I trust my brother-in-law? Can we turn lead into gold before my treasury vault starts looking embarrassing? Some of the most ambitious alchemical goals involve transmutation, transforming base metals like lead into noble ones like silver or gold. While this dream never succeeded chemically, it did succeed economically. Nobles poured money into these underground labs hoping for miraculous returns. A patient alchemist could secure funding for years by providing promising reports, mysterious diagrams, or the occasional shiny but strategically placed sample that hinted at success. It was a medieval version of a startup pitch, complete with unclear data and soaring optimism. The atmosphere of secrecy was not paranoia, it was practical necessity. Strange odours, unexpected combustion, and bizarre noises drifting through the castle could cause panic if not properly contained. Many alchemist rooms had their own ventilation shafts to carry fumes upward and away, though sometimes the air exited near enough to servants' quarters that rumours of ghosts, demons, or the world ending again circulated regularly. But despite the chaos, these workshops produced real advancements. Experiments with distillation led to purer alcohols and early medicinal extracts. Metallurgical studies improved forging techniques and understanding of alloys. Pigment research expanded artistic possibilities. Even failed experiments broadened medieval knowledge, teaching what not to do, which in an age of minimal safety protocols was arguably more important. At times, the forbidden cellars became hubs of quiet collaboration. Healers, alchemists, and scholars traded observations, debated theories, and scribbled notes in margins. Their work formed the seeds of future scientific inquiry, early chemistry, early pharmacology, early physics. Hidden beneath stone arches and flickering torches, medieval curiosity thrived quietly and steadily, far from the judgment of those who preferred their world predictable. Of course, not all nobles approved. Some saw alchemy as heretical, useless, or dangerous. When tensions rose, these cellars could be abruptly sealed, their tools confiscated, their practitioners dismissed or worse. But as long as there were unanswered questions and wealthy patrons hoping for miracles, alchemist workshops endured in one form or another. By the time footsteps echoed up the stairs and doors latched behind them, these rooms often looked perfectly ordinary from outside. Only the faint smell of sulphur, charcoal dust, and something that might have once been a frog hinted at the strange work within. With the alchemist's world explored, we now move into a more architectural marvel, the undercrofts, those massive vaulted chambers that supported castles physically and economically, creating a foundation for life above while quietly shaping life below. If the upper levels of a medieval castle displayed power, the undercrofts displayed practicality, vast, echoing chambers carved from stone that served as the quiet backbone of castle life. They supported great halls above, stored goods below, hosted gatherings, sheltered trade, and functioned as the castle's catch-all space for everything that didn't fit neatly elsewhere. An undercroft could be anything as then, except well heated. Architecturally, undercrofts were marvels of endurance. They were designed first and foremost to hold weight. Thick pillars rose from the floor like stone forests, supporting vaulted ceilings that bore the immense load of entire floors above. These vaults, often ribbed or barrel-shaped, distributed pressure across the structure with surprising elegance. Even without decoration, an undercroft demanded respect. It felt timeless, solemn, and slightly intimidating, like standing inside the ribs of a giant granite creature. Builders didn't aim for beauty here, but the geometry of necessity created something close to it anyway. Yet undercrofts weren't simply structural. Their cool, stable temperatures made them ideal for all kinds of storage, not just food, which found homes in other underground chambers, but goods tied to the castle's economy. Cloth bolts, imported wines, oil amphorae, firewood, building materials, tools, textiles, and seasonal supplies all found a place here. Merchant wagons arriving through castle gates unloaded their wares into these stone caverns before they ever reached the bustling floors above. And because undercrofts were spacious and relatively open, they served as temporary holding zones for stockpiles during festivals, renovations, repairs, or times when castle organisation teetered on chaos. But storage was only the beginning. In many castles, undercrofts doubled as meeting spaces, a deliberate choice rooted in both privacy and practicality. If nobles wanted to gather discreetly to discuss political alliances, inheritance disputes, taxation problems, or why the king's cousin had made yet another questionable decision, the undercroft provided a perfect setting, secluded, sturdy, and so uncomfortable that no one lingered long enough to start unrelated arguments. The cool air kept tempers steady, and the dim lighting discouraged theatrics. Conversations held here were serious, focused, and slightly hurried, thanks to the constant chill that seeped through boots and cloaks. During turbulent times, undercrofts also served as administrative centres. Officials met to tally harvests, plan defences, sort tribute, or organise supply chains. Scribes sat at makeshift desks copying records while their ink stiffened in the cold. Guards patrolled the perimeters, their breath visible as they checked storeroom locks. Every task echoed through the arches, a soundtrack of murmurs, quill scratching, and the distant clank of someone dropping something fragile. And when peace reigned, the undercroft could transform into something entirely different, a market. Yes, castles sometimes hosted small indoor markets within their undercrofts, especially during winter or bad weather. Merchants set up stalls along the pillar rows, offering spices, cloth, pottery, tools, candles, and trinkets. Villagers seeking shelter from rain or frost gathered here to trade, gossip, or negotiate in the half-light. Horses and carts remained outside, but the human energy filled the stone chamber with warmth, social warmth anyway, because physical warmth was in short supply. Even bustling markets couldn't quite shake the cold that lurked permanently in the stones. The acoustics were unforgettable. Undercrofts amplified sound in strange ways. A whispered conversation might travel farther than intended, while a shout might vanish upward into the vaults as though swallowed by the ceiling. Servants moving crates seemed to stomp like giants. Dogs barking outside sounded like they were trapped somewhere within the walls. And any negotiation held here had to contend with the echoes. Many a medieval merchant learned to identify their own voice bouncing back as if disagreeing with them. Despite their many uses, undercrofts were not without inconveniences. Moisture seeped through the walls in damp seasons. Cold clung to everything. A jug left on the floor overnight could feel close to iced by morning. Lighting was limited to torches or lanterns, creating a flicker-filled atmosphere that made shadows dance unpredictably. Anything stored here needed careful protection from mould, pests, and the occasional over-enthusiastic draft. And because undercrofts were lower than ground level, they sometimes became accidental flood zones during heavy rains, transforming a bustling meeting space into an impromptu indoor pond that everyone blamed on the weather, while pretending not to notice design flaws. Yet for all these quirks, undercrofts were indispensable. They provided flexibility, a rare commodity in a fortress built primarily for defence. Their open layout allowed adaptation to shifting needs, war preparations, seasonal transitions, supply organisation, trade fairs, political strategy, emergency shelter, or even clandestine gatherings after dark. They were as close as a castle came to having a multi-purpose room, engineered centuries before any architect used the phrase. And because undercrofts connected to other subterranean passageways, they acted as crossroads of movement. Servants scurried through on errands, guards crossed through on patrol routes, artisans paused here while transporting materials. Clergy passed quietly on their way to crypts. Even nobles occasionally descended, reluctantly, shivering the entire time, to attend important councils or settle disputes. To walk through an undercroft was to feel the pulse of the castle, calm, practical, and always ready to shift as needed. It held the castle up, literally and figuratively, proving that strength didn't always come from battlements or armour, but from the often overlooked spaces that connected everything else. With this architectural backbone explored, our next descent leads us into something far more human and far less stable. The hidden cells where nobles held political hostages, turning underground chambers into bargaining chips in the power games of the medieval world. Medieval politics thrived on alliances, betrayals, and the occasional friendly kidnapping, which meant castles needed a place to store their most valuable political assets, hostages. These weren't ordinary prisoners. They weren't thieves, rebels, or unlucky travellers. These were nobles, dignitaries, heirs, or negotiators who found themselves involuntarily enrolled in diplomacy's least glamorous tradition. You weren't a guest, you were a human bargaining chip with room service by rats. Unlike the grim oubliettes or isolation pits deeper in the castle, hostage chambers were not built for torment. Their purpose was leverage. Hostages needed to stay alive, unbroken, and valuable enough to compel cooperation from whoever wanted them back. But they also needed to remain unseen, inaccessible to rescue attempts, and inconvenient enough to remind their families that negotiations were not optional. Thus, hidden holding rooms were tucked into underground spaces that balanced restraint and preservation with a level of discomfort that encouraged prompt political action. These chambers varied widely in design. Some were small, vaulted rooms with simple bedding, water jugs, and a barred door, secure but not cruel. Others resembled sparsely furnished apartments, offering relative comfort with seating, writing materials, or even fresh straw changed semi-regularly. Much depended on the hostage's status and the captor's intentions. A noble child destined for an arranged alliance might be treated gently. A rival lord suspected of treachery might receive a bed that creaked ominously and blankets that smelled like they'd survived 3 previous wars. No matter the furnishings, these chambers were always hidden. Builders integrated them into the castle's subterranean layout with deceptive brilliance. Some were accessible only through twisting side passages. Others lay behind false walls or beneath trapdoors cleverly disguised beneath crates or carpet. A guard escorting a hostage didn't simply take them downstairs. They took them somewhere else entirely, leaving little trace of the route. Maps of these spaces were tightly restricted, often held only by the castle's steward or the lord's most trusted advisors. If a hostage tried to escape alone, they'd likely wander into a storage room, a dead end, or a completely different problem. Ideally, something that convinced them escape was more trouble than it was worth. The political purpose behind hostage-taking was straightforward: ensure compliance. A rebellious vassal might suddenly rediscover loyalty if their son lived in the castle basement. A rival lord might hesitate to raise arms if his nephew was enjoying an extended involuntary stay elsewhere. Even kings used the tactic, exchanging hostages with lesser nobles to guarantee peace treaties, tax agreements, or military support. Ransom culture was woven into medieval diplomacy. Money, land, loyalty, and even silence could all be purchased with a well-placed prisoner. A hostage's treatment depended heavily on how negotiations progressed. If talks went well, guards might bring decent meals, allow supervised walks, or provide warm blankets. If talks stalled, the menu might suddenly downgrade to less desirable offerings, the chamber might feel colder, and rats, ever the castle's most reliable tenants, might become more visible. It was passive-aggressive diplomacy, medieval style. However, mistreatment was usually avoided. A dead hostage was worse than useless. It was a political disaster. So while these captives weren't pampered, they were preserved. Guards checked regularly for illness, supplies were monitored, letters were sometimes delivered, though heavily censored. Hostages could spend months or years in these rooms, long enough to memorize every stone, every drip in the ceiling, and every guard whose footsteps signaled mealtime. One of the strangest aspects of this underground negotiation tactic was that hostages often grew up inside these spaces. Children held for political leverage might spend their formative years learning castle etiquette, languages, or swordplay under their captors' care. These children weren't quite prisoners, yet not quite guests. They belonged to a category medieval society accepted without blinking: political insurance. Some hostages even forged relationships with their captors. A young heir raised alongside the lord's children might form surprising friendships. Friendships immediately tested the moment their family decided whether to honour or betray an agreement. Political irony was never in short supply. On the logistical side, hostage chambers created daily work for guards and stewards. Guards rotated shifts to prevent fraternization or bribery, though bribery still happened, often with astonishing creativity. Stewards managed supplies delicately, ensuring a balance between adequate care and calculated discomfort. Messages passed between captors and hostage families were written with exquisite vagueness. "Your daughter remains in good health" might mean anything from "she's well fed and reading poetry" to "she survived the rat situation this week." These underground prisoners also represented financial opportunity. Ransom payments were lucrative. A wealthy noble might pay staggering sums to retrieve a valuable relative. Entire estates changed hands through negotiations centered on a single person held beneath a castle. Hostages shaped alliances, forced agreements, postponed wars, and occasionally started them when negotiations fell apart. Few underground rooms had such dramatic impact on medieval politics. When release finally came, it was a ritual of relief and suspicion. Hostages emerged pale, stiff, and blinking like creatures unused to sunlight. They were cleaned up, dressed properly, and presented for exchange like precious commodities. Some returned home as symbols of resilience, others returned as reminders of humiliation, and many never forgot the stone walls that defined their captivity. Today, archaeologists investigating castle basements sometimes find traces of these forgotten chambers. extra doorways, oddly placed ventilation holes, or remnant hinges that suggest a room meant for someone too important to torture and too dangerous to trust. The stories behind them linger in the silence. With the political world of hidden captives explored, our journey now moves towards something far less personal but equally dramatic, the buried remnants of warfare, collapsed tunnels, abandoned mines, and scarred layers that reveal the violent history lying beneath many medieval castles. For all their grandeur, medieval castles were not serene monuments, they were battlegrounds layered in centuries of conflict. Above ground, walls were rebuilt, towers repaired, and scorch marks politely scraped away before visiting nobility arrived. But underground, that was where the scars truly lived. Beneath many castles lies a buried palimpsest of war. Collapsed tunnels, abandoned mines, shattered stone chambers, and fossilized remnants of destruction that time politely covered but never erased. Archaeology, discovering that medieval warfare was just organized chaos with shovels. One of the most dramatic forms of subterranean damage came from sapping and counter-sapping, the medieval art of attacking a castle not by storming the walls but by burrowing under them. Siege engineers dug tunnels toward the fortress foundations, propping them with timber and filling them with whatever flammable material they could muster. Straw, brushwood, fat, oils, or if morale was very low, anything they could scrape off a nearby farm. Once the tunnel reached a critical point beneath the wall, the attackers lit the support beams, which collapsed as they burned. Without support, the earth above sank, the wall sagged inward, and suddenly defenders were facing a very unplanned architectural renovation. But defenders weren't passive. They dug countermines, hasty, frantic tunnels carved in the opposite direction. These underground battles turned the soil into a warren of intersecting passages where soldiers listened desperately for the scrape of enemy shovels. If they pinpointed the attacking tunnel, they could break through and fight in the darkness, where sight was useless and chaos ruled. Some chronicles describe these encounters as some of the most terrifying combat of the medieval era. Men battling in cramped tunnels lit by single torches, half choked by dust, unsure if the next vibration meant enemy movement or their entire world about to collapse. The remains of these mining wars still lie beneath castles. Archaeologists uncover sections of tunnels abruptly caved in, their ceilings bowed by ancient stress. Charred timber fragments testify to fires that once roared underground. In some places, the soil layers bear the unmistakable distortion of subsidence, where the earth slumped after a wall partially collapsed. It's a geological fingerprint of conflict, etched permanently into the land. Siege remnants often extended beyond mining. During prolonged assaults, both attackers and defenders modified the terrain around and beneath the castle. Attackers dug trenches and tunnels attempting to approach unseen. Defenders dug hidden escape or supply routes that later fell into disuse, eventually collapsing in forgotten corners. Storage pits hastily carved during sieges remained half-filled. Their stone walls cracked under pressure from above. The earth became a battlefield long before soldiers clashed face to face, and then there were the unintended consequences. A collapsing mine might bring down part of an underground chamber that had nothing to do with the war effort. Entire storage rooms vanished into pits. Portions of servant corridors became twisted stone cavities. Wells cracked and shifted. Foundations warped. Medieval warfare didn't just shape history, it reshaped geology. Long after the fighting stopped, nature began reclaiming the wreckage. Soil filtered into abandoned tunnels. Water seeped through fractured stone, leaving mineral deposits that hardened into strange formations. Roots intruded, weaving through cracks and merging with the ruined architecture. By the time archaeologists arrived centuries later, the underground destruction could look almost organic, as if the earth itself had once decided it was tired of castle politics and tried to swallow the structure whole. Some discoveries are surprisingly dramatic. In a few castles, archaeologists found collapsed chambers filled with shattered pottery, discarded armour fragments, or piles of stones clearly intended as emergency missile supplies. These were caught in the middle of chaos, objects trapped in time when the ceiling suddenly gave way. Elsewhere, they found soot-stained ceilings that suggested underground fires so intense they baked the stone. These fires rarely stayed confined. Smoke and heat travelled through corridors, leaving haunting traces of panic and desperation. Abandoned mines also tell stories of battles that never escalated. Some tunnels were started and quickly abandoned when attackers realised the soil was too rocky or the defenders too alert. These half-finished passageways twist like incomplete thoughts, strategies interrupted by reality. Pick marks remain on stone walls, the last strokes of workers who likely fled when circumstances changed. A few mines ended abruptly at sheer rock faces, testament to siege engineers who optimistically believed they could dig through anything until nature proved otherwise. Buried battle damage also provides insight into medieval innovation. Engineers experimented constantly, improving tunnel vents, creating early structural supports, and developing ways to detect underground movement. Some castles installed underground listening chambers, small alcoves where guards pressed their ears to the stone to detect vibrations. Imagine sitting in a dark room beneath a castle, straining to hear faint scraping through layers of earth, knowing that every sound might signal a fight you couldn't see coming. Yet for all the terror and destruction, the underground remnants of war also reveal resilience. After a siege, builders didn't always repair underground damage. Sometimes they sealed it off, allowing the fractured chambers to become silent echoes of past violence. Other times they used partially collapsed tunnels as convenient dumping grounds for rubble or broken weapons, an archaeological treasure trove if not a sanitary one. Layer upon layer of conflict accumulated until the castle sat atop a buried archive of centuries-old emergencies. To walk beneath such a castle today is to sense the magnitude of battles long forgotten. Every crack, every collapsed arch, and every soot-blackened stone is a reminder that medieval warfare wasn't just fought above ground with swords and arrows. It was fought beneath the surface with shovels, fire, and claustrophobic courage. With these ruined battle layers explored, our next descent shifts from the destructive to the discreet. The secret royal passageways used not for war or escape from siege, but for escaping awkward situations, questionable scandals, and relatives who asked too many questions. If the public halls of a medieval castle were stages for ceremony, diplomacy, and stiff etiquette, the secret passageways beneath them were stages for everything else. Affairs, political plots, private arguments, bribes, clandestine alliances, and the occasional let's hide this relative before someone notices, all played out in narrow, dimly lit tunnels, carved specifically so royals and nobles could do things they preferred not to explain later. Nothing says romance like a damp stone tunnel and the risk of tripping over a chamber pot. These passageways were not the grand, sweeping corridors of fantasy stories. They were practical, cramped, and intentionally unremarkable. Builders carved them into the in-between spaces of castle architecture, behind walls, beneath floors, within unused foundation pockets, or sandwiched between layers of stone like an embarrassing family secret. Their very existence depended on the idea that nobody should know they existed. Well, nobody except the people using them to avoid being seen entering or leaving certain rooms with suspicious frequency. Royal affairs were one of the most common uses for these tunnels. High-ranking nobles, especially those married for political reasons rather than love, often sought romance elsewhere. But romance required privacy, and privacy in a castle full of guards, servants, scribes, advisors, and wandering relatives was nearly impossible. Thus, hidden doorways disguised as stone panels or cleverly carved into decorative alcoves became the perfect portals for midnight rendezvous. A king, queen, or noble could slip through an innocuous wall, descend a few steps, and emerge behind a tapestry in someone else's chamber. Subtle? No. Effective? Usually. Political plotting also thrived in these subterranean shortcuts. Alliances formed not in brightly lit council chambers, but in quiet corners beneath the floorboards. Advisors met with envoys at odd hours, Conspirators exchanged messages nobody else could overhear, and nobles practiced the timeless art of saying one thing publicly while arranging something entirely different underground. These tunnels allowed conversations to occur without witnesses, unless one counted the occasional rat who, to be fair, was very discreet. Even the architecture reflected this clandestine purpose. Passageways were narrow enough to discourage gatherings, forcing conspirators to huddle close and whisper. Ceilings were low, reminding their users that scandal requires humility, or at least flexibility. Floors were uneven enough to make certain dramatic exits far less dramatic when someone stumbled over an unexpected stone. Torches gave off wavering, unreliable light that made shadows dance in unnerving ways, giving the impression that the castle itself was eavesdropping. Not all scandals involved romance or politics. Sometimes the problem was simply a relative, a loud one, a troublesome one, or one with a talent for embarrassing themselves at inopportune moments. Castle families were large, complicated, and often fueled by grudges older than the building itself. When disagreements flared or an unruly cousin drank too much at a feast, secret passageways made discreet removal possible. Instead of hauling the offender through crowded corridors, a servant could guide them down a hidden stairwell and out of sight before anyone else realized something had gone terribly, predictably wrong. These passageways also allowed nobles to bypass public obligations. Imagine a visiting dignitary who insisted on discussing trade law for hours, or a feast guest whose stories about grain yields never ended. A strategic cough, a polite excuse, a step behind a curtain, and suddenly the host vanished into a tunnel, leaving their companions wondering if they had witnessed diplomacy or magic. It was the medieval equivalent of slipping out the back door of a party, except with more stone and significantly worse lighting. Some castles featured entire networks of these hidden walkways, connecting bedchambers, council rooms, chapels, gardens, and even exterior courtyards. These networks made it possible to move across the entire castle without ever appearing in a main hallway. While the public saw lords and ladies descending noble staircases with grace, the private reality involved far more scrambling through narrow spaces, dodging cobwebs, and hoping no one would ask why the royal boots were covered in dust. Guard knowledge of these tunnels varied by castle. In some strongholds, only the lord and a few trusted servants knew the full layout, ensuring absolute secrecy. In others, guards were informed so they could escort important figures or monitor for misuse, but even then, knowledge was compartmentalized. A guard might know one section, a steward another, and a chamberlain a third, ensuring that no one below royal rank could navigate the entire system alone. The castle protected its secrets by dividing them. Over time, as castles were renovated and expanded, some passageways were accidentally sealed, forgotten, or swallowed by structural shifts. Future generations renovating a room might suddenly discover a narrow stairway behind a wall, a medieval reminder that scandal-proof architecture had once existed here. Occasionally, these rediscovered tunnels contained relics of their past lives. Dropped rings, candle holders, scraps of parchment, or the remains of a cloak someone lost while fleeing a particularly awkward conversation. In a few rare cases, secret passageways linked to the outside world, blending scandal avoidance with the emergency escape. A noble leaving the castle under cover of darkness could avoid both assassins and nosy neighbours. But these exits were dangerous. The journey from a damp stone tunnel to a forest at midnight required both courage and a good sense of direction, neither of which nobles consistently possessed. Despite their many uses, these secret passageways symbolize something deeper about medieval life, the contrast between public image and private reality. Castles were built to project authority, stability, and moral order, while below, the same rulers lived messy, complicated, deeply human lives, filled with the secrets, longings, rivalries, and regrets. The stone walls above inspired awe, the passageways below whispered truth. With the scandal tunnels explored, we now move to something inscribed beneath the stone rather than hidden behind it. The cryptic messages, graffiti, and carved symbols left by prisoners, servants, masons, and wanderers who etched their stories into the castle's forgotten walls. Long after the voices of medieval castle residents fell silent, their words, and sometimes their doodles, remained scratched into the stone. These inscriptions, carved into hidden corridors, guard posts, stairwells, prison walls, and forgotten alcoves, form a quiet archive of everyday medieval thoughts, prayers, warnings, jokes, hopes, and the universal human impulse to say, "I was here." Even in the Middle Ages, people wrote "I was here" when bored. Unlike official records or illuminated manuscripts, these markings weren't produced for prestige. They were created in moments of waiting, watching, fearing, or simply trying not to fall asleep during a long shift. Stone was the nearest parchment, a dagger or nail the nearest pen. Over centuries, the castle accumulated messages like a living diary etched directly into its bones. Prisoner inscriptions are among the most poignant. In underground cells or holding chambers, political captives and unfortunate troublemakers carved their thoughts into the walls, leaving behind emotional fingerprints. Some etched their names, hoping memory might outlast their captivity. Others recorded days spent below or scratched tally marks marking time, each line a reminder of endurance or despair. Some carved prayers begging saints for deliverance. A few carved curses aimed at guards, nobles, or entire bloodlines. And then there were the artists, prisoners who, lacking hope of freedom, spent their energy carving ships, animals, saints, or intricate patterns, turning their confinement into makeshift galleries. Servants left different messages. Their inscriptions tended to be practical or humorous, hidden along the narrow passages where they scurried between duties. A kitchen boy might carve a small symbol so he wouldn't lose his way in dim corridors. A laundress might scratch a flower beside a stairwell because it briefly made her day softer. Servants working exhausting shifts left graffiti that said more about the castle than any chronicler ever could. Jokes about demanding nobles, reminders of where certain supplies belonged, or comments like, "Do not lean here, the wall bites," which likely referred to falling mortar, but could just as easily have been a servant's attempt to keep others from resting too long. Masons also left their mark, literally. As the craftsmen responsible for shaping the castle's stonework, they carved symbols to identify their labour for payment, craftsmanship pride, or record-keeping. These mason marks look like cryptic runes, triangles, arrows, spirals, intersecting lines. Each symbol represented a specific worker or workshop. They weren't meant as decoration but as signatures hidden in plain sight scattered across foundation stones, pillars, and vaults. To the untrained eye, they look mysterious. To medieval stonemasons, they were simply invoices carved into immortality. However, not every inscription was practical or solemn. Guards, arguably the most bored population in the medieval castle, left behind the most eclectic graffiti. Hours of standing watch in drafty corridors produced a unique brand of carved commentary. Some recorded weather observations, cold again, others drew crude doodles, and a few carved rough calendars counting days till relief. Many guards carved their names alongside symbols of rank, pride, or sheer boredom. If you ever see a crudely carved sword next to a name, it probably belonged to a guard trying to look intimidating while fighting the urge to nap. Even the religious left inscriptions. Pilgrim crosses carved into walls near chapels or crypt entrances marked acts of devotion. Tiny carved fish or chalices signalled silent prayers. Some inscriptions quoted scripture in abbreviated Latin, left by visiting clerics or castle priests who needed a place to record a spiritual moment, preferably somewhere no servant could dust it off. Then there are the mysterious ones. Strange geometric shapes, unfamiliar symbols, incomplete phrases in fading medieval dialects, markings whose meanings are lost. Some might have been coded messages passed during tense political times. Some might have been early attempts at warding symbols against evil spirits. Others might simply have been medieval doodles that modern historians interpret far too seriously. A circle with lines could be a magical talisman, or a bored teenager carving the world's earliest attempt at a smiley face. The placement of inscriptions also tells stories. In tight corners or near stairwells, carvings often relate to directions, medieval GPS systems written in cryptic shorthand. Near guard posts, messages warn of troublesome visitors, sneaky rats, or structural issues like mind the crack, advice which modern archaeologists appreciate more than anyone else. Along long corridors, repeating symbols suggest communal roots or shared traditions among servants. In prison cells, carvings cluster near the only light source, as captives worked where shadows didn't steal their vision. Over time, castle life layered these messages atop one another like sediment. A servant's mark might sit beside a mason's symbol from 200 years earlier. A prisoner's plea might overlap a guard's idle sketch. History became not just written, but scratched, gouged, and etched into the stone. Accidental time capsules recording moments too small for chronicles, but too human to erase. For modern explorers of castle ruins, discovering these markings is like hearing faint whispers from people who lived centuries ago. A name carved into stone transforms a forgotten worker into an individual again. A tally of days restores a prisoner's humanity. A crude drawing raises a smile and reminds us that humour, the stubborn, irrepressible kind, has survived in every era. And beneath it all lies a strange truth. Castles may crumble, but the graffiti endures. Having uncovered these cryptic messages, we move next into an archaeological feast of a different sort. The buried evidence of medieval diets, where bones, discarded dishes, and kitchen debris reveal what castle residents cooked, celebrated, and regretted eating. If you really want to understand how people lived in a medieval castle, what they ate, what they valued, what they wasted, and what they regretted, you don't go to the Great Hall, you go to the trash. Specifically the enormous buried middens beneath castle courtyards and service yards, where centuries of feasting debris accumulated layer by fragrant layer. Archaeologists adore these sites because medieval trash reveals everything from diet to social hierarchy to culinary disasters that someone definitely hoped no one would ever discover. Medieval trash, because even nobles couldn't resist breaking dishes dramatically. These waste pits weren't random heaps. Castles had designated dumping areas, often downhill from living quarters, or tucked into forgotten corners. Over decades, these pits filled with compacted layers of debris, bones from lavish feasts, shattered pottery, discarded tools, broken utensils, and the occasional mystery object whose original purpose scholars still debate. Once the pit filled, servants covered it with soil, and a new layer of castle history began. By the time a castle reached its prime, its buried trash piles could form archaeological lasagnas, neatly stacked layers of human behaviour. The animal bones form one of the richest sources of information. Nobles enjoyed extravagant menus: venison, beef, boar, swan, goose, rabbit, and occasionally animals chosen less for taste and more for dramatic effect at banquets. The bones reveal butchery techniques, cooking methods, and even which cuts of meat went to whom. Large, premium cuts often correlate with noble consumption, while smaller or tougher pieces, ribs, joints, or knuckles, speak to the servant diet. Burn marks show where cooks roasted meat too eagerly. Knife marks show where carvers either displayed pride or rushed through preparations before a lord became impatient. Some pits include bones of more exotic species, peacocks, for instance, whose brightly coloured feathers were reattached to cooked bodies for spectacle, or imported fish from distant trade routes, suggesting wealth and high status. Sometimes archaeologists uncover charred bones from failed kitchen experiments, as well as entire joints of meat apparently tossed aside because someone miscalculated cooking time by several hours. Castle kitchens were powerful, but they were not infallible. Then come the broken dishes, the ceramic confetti of medieval dining. Even wealthy households relied heavily on pottery for everyday meals, and pottery, being pottery, breaks whenever gravity takes offence. Castle life was busy, chaotic, and fueled by servants carrying stacks of plates under tremendous pressure. Dropping a dish wasn't just an accident, it was an occupational hazard. The shards that survive underground reveal decorative patterns, trade connections, and social habits. Fine imported ceramics point to wealthy trade networks. Rough earthenware indicates daily use, and the sheer number of broken pieces suggests that every medieval kitchen had moments when a servant thought, "If I hear one more noble complain about the soup temperature, I may contribute another dish to archaeology." Luxury items also found their way into these pits, not out of carelessness, but because everything breaks eventually. Glass goblets shattered during banquets, bronze utensils bent out of shape, silver-plated serving dishes cracked or dented beyond salvage. A single pit might hold fragments of once-cherished items, remnants of decorated candlesticks, ornate bowls, or glassware imported across continents. These objects didn't simply represent wealth, they reflected the ebb and flow of a castle's financial and political fortunes. One layer might contain plenty of luxury dining ware, while the layer above, from a harsher decade, shows a shift to simpler materials. Even cooking tools make appearances. Burned-out ladles, chipped knives, snapped spits, cracked cauldrons all end up underground. Some bear the unmistakable marks of heavy use, their surfaces worn smooth from years of stirring, boiling, chopping or scraping. Others show signs of sudden failure, a pot shattered from uneven heating, a knife blade broken from too much force, a pan warped beyond recognition. These artifacts expose the intense labour behind every meal. Castle kitchens were battlefields of heat, steel and urgency, and the tools reflect that. Food remnants tell stories too. Seed shells and charred grains hint at ingredients used for breads, porridges, and seasonal dishes. Fruit pits from apples, cherries, plums, or imported delicacies reveal trade patterns and feast menus. Fish scales from freshwater lakes or distant coasts illuminate distribution networks. Layers containing mostly grain husks might hint at famine years. Layers filled with rich animal remains speak of times of prosperity. You can almost track the castle's emotional climate through its culinary debris. Lean years, feast years, and years when someone discovered spices and went slightly overboard. Buried waste also exposes the human side of castle life, the mistakes, the accidents, and the occasional drama. If a noble flipped a table in anger, a surprisingly common occurrence, the shattered remains of that moment might be preserved underground. If a servant secretly broke a valuable plate and hid the evidence, the truth emerges centuries later, much to the delight of archaeologists who know that guilt transcends eras. If a meal went disastrously wrong, say a roasted boar fell off the spit into the hearth, the bones might reveal the exact moment culinary optimism met gravity. Beyond food, other small finds add nuance to the picture. Beads from clothing, buckles from belts, remnants of toys, lost rings, buttons, game pieces, even writing styluses snapped in frustration or dropped inadvertently. These artifacts show that refuse was not just garbage. It was the unwanted output of human life. Each object carried a story, sometimes dramatic, sometimes mundane, preserved only because it became unintended archaeology. Today, excavating a castle waste pit is like performing a slow, meticulous resurrection of everyday life. Archaeologists sift through layers, reconstruct fragments, and assemble the hidden narrative of what people ate, how they lived, and what they allowed to break. In many cases, these pits reveal more honesty than official records ever do. For all the romance surrounding medieval castles, few people imagine the backstage machinery that kept them running, the winches creaking below floors, the hidden hoists rattling in the walls, the gears spinning in dim, torchlit chambers, and the platforms rising and falling like scenes from an early, slightly dangerous prototype of an elevator. Medieval engineers were either geniuses or men, one pulley away from disaster. The medieval castle was not just stone and muscle. It relied on complex mechanical systems tucked beneath its floors and woven through its underground corridors. These technologies were practical, improvisational, and occasionally spectacular when they worked, and even more spectacular when they didn't. One of the most widespread hidden devices was the counterweighted hoist. These ingenious rigs used ropes, pulleys, and heavy stones to lift goods from underground storage rooms to kitchens, armories, or halls above. Instead of dragging barrels of wine up slippery stairs, servants attached them to hooks, pulled on ropes routed through ceiling beams, and let gravity do half the work. When diagrams of these setups appear in manuscripts, they look deceptively simple. But constructing a reliable hoist in a damp basement full of mice, smoke, and the occasional panicked servant required patience and a healthy disregard for danger. Some castles took this idea even further, building vertical shafts for raising platforms. These proto-elevators carried goods, and sometimes people, between levels. Picture a wooden platform the size of a door frame, suspended by ropes wound around a massive drum turned by a winch team. The system could transport food to great halls, weapons to battlements, or even distinguished guests who preferred not to climb endless staircases. However, if a rope snapped or a mechanism jammed, the ride became significantly more memorable. Medieval users learned quickly to hold on tightly and to avoid making sudden movements that might encourage gravity to assert its authority. Winches themselves were marvels of medieval craftsmanship. They appeared everywhere, in deep storage pits, in drawbridge chambers, in siege engines, and in underground spaces where heavy stones needed moving. Some were powered by hand, others by tread wheels, giant wooden hamster wheels powered by human or animal labour. A man walking inside a treadwheel could lift enormous weights with surprisingly little effort. These wheels made everything possible: raising portcullises, hauling stones, hoisting siege weapons, and even helping construction crews place massive blocks in castle walls. But working inside a treadwheel was no glamorous job. One slip and you discover the terrifying physics of being run over by a machine powered by your co-workers. Equally fascinating were the gearing systems. Medieval engineers used wooden gears with iron or bronze teeth to transfer motion or change direction. In underground chambers, gears connected turning wheels to distant mechanisms, a winch here, a hoist there, allowing small teams to control large moving parts. Some gears operated hidden doors or trap mechanisms, others powered water lifting devices like bucket chains or early pumps designed to keep wells functioning during droughts or sieges. While these machines were rudimentary by modern standards, they demonstrated remarkable creativity in adapting simple materials to accomplish complex tasks. In a few castles, archaeologists have uncovered traces of rotating platforms or concealed turntables, used either to move large objects or to present goods dramatically in halls above. Such features highlight the medieval love for spectacle. Even engineering could be theatrical when nobles were involved. These mechanisms often relied on precision carpentry and carefully placed pivot stones, the latter acting as silent, durable bearings. Siege innovation also left its mark underground. During wartime, engineers built concealed machine rooms where counterweight trebuchets or mangonels could be assembled or repaired away from enemy eyes. Some tunnels housed rolling mechanisms for transporting heavy war engines to strategic openings. Others contained racks of spare ropes, beams, and iron fittings needed for rapid adjustments. Defense required constant improvisation, and these hidden workshops were the beating heart of medieval problem-solving. One of the strangest technological mysteries found beneath certain castles is the so-called echo duct. These narrow stone channels seem to have been constructed intentionally to carry sound, either amplifying footsteps from outside or allowing guards to listen for underground movement during sieges. Scholars debate their function, but their acoustic properties are undeniable. A whisper in one corner can travel astonishing distances, magnified into something eerie and powerful. Whether used for surveillance, communication, or simply as a medieval experiment in architectural acoustics, these ducts reveal how versatile underground engineering could be. Of course, not every mechanical system aged gracefully. Wood rotted, iron rusted, ropes frayed, mechanisms jammed after decades of disuse. Eventually, some were forgotten entirely, leaving future inhabitants puzzled to discover a carved shaft that seemed to lead nowhere, or a chamber containing inexplicable wooden wheels fused together by centuries of humidity. More than one archaeologist has entered a forgotten mechanical room expecting storage and instead found the medieval equivalent of a buried machine shop. These remnants tell a story that is often overshadowed by the spectacle of knights, banners and battles, the story of medieval engineering. Castles were not static monuments but living, moving systems, powered by ingenuity and necessity. Fear, ambition, hunger and convenience all drove castle designers to innovate. And while not every device worked flawlessly or at all, the existence of these underground machines proves that medieval technology was far more advanced, creative and experimental than many assume. Now that we have examined the forgotten mechanisms buried below, our journey continues into spaces shaped not by machinery or war, but by time and accident, the lost chambers sealed off by renovations, collapses, and centuries of shifting stone waiting quietly for rediscovery. Castles were not built in a day, nor were they static monuments. They expanded, contracted, shifted, burned, rebuilt, and reinvented themselves over generations. But all that architectural enthusiasm came with unintended consequences. Lost rooms, entire chambers sealed behind new walls, trapped beneath collapsed ceilings, buried under rubble, or quietly absorbed into fresh construction plans. Some rooms were forgotten for centuries, much like medieval homework. These lost chambers came into being for many reasons. Sometimes they were casualties of renovation. A new hall needed to be larger, so a wall was moved inward. A corridor needed straightening, so an awkward corner was boxed in. Architects and masons often prioritized efficiency over perfect spatial logic. If a small storage room stood in the way of an ambitious redesign, well, it simply ceased to exist, not removed, but sealed. Nobody bothered updating maps that barely existed to begin with, and soon the empty space vanished from collective memory. Other forgotten rooms were created by collapse. Castles experienced fires, earthquakes, floods, sieges, and the simple but relentless march of time. When ceilings fell or floors gave way, cleaning up the mess wasn't always practical. Instead, builders bricked off the damaged area, reinforcing the surrounding structure and leaving the ruined chamber entombed. Over centuries, rubble settled, walls shifted, and the abandoned space became indistinguishable from solid stone, at least until some future archaeologist entered what they thought was a wall and realized it had suspiciously empty resonance. Fires produced their own particular brand of lost architecture. Medieval fire didn't politely stay in fireplaces. It spread through rafters, tapestries, and furniture with an enthusiasm unmatched by any other natural force inside a castle. When flames damaged upper floors, falling beams and debris occasionally sealed lower rooms by accident. In other cases, repairs after the fire altered the layout so thoroughly that older chambers ended up trapped inside layers of new construction. Once the ashes cooled and rebuilding began, priorities focused on the visible castle, not on the dark pocket of space beneath a newly laid floor that no one remembered was once a pantry or guard room. Some rooms disappeared because their purpose faded. A retired treasury vault, an outdated armory compartment, or a former servant passage could become irrelevant with new castle ownership or structural changes. If nobody needed it anymore and it complicated renovations, it was easier to wall it up than to dismantle it. Over time, the room's previous function slipped from memory. Servants who once used it died or left. Records were sparse. Eventually that chamber existed only as a hollow ghost inside the stone. Accidental sealing could also occur during defensive upgrades. When an outer wall was thickened or a tower reinforced, interior spaces were sometimes absorbed into the new structure. A tiny guard room, a prayer niche, even small stairwells could inadvertently end up inside solid masonry. One medieval mason reportedly filled an unused watch closet with rubble and sealed it, writing on a nearby stone, "No more room." He meant it literally. What lay inside these lost spaces when rediscovered? A mesmerizing variety of time capsules. Some chambers held domestic remnants untouched for centuries. Overturned stools, rusted candle holders, forgotten tools, cracked pottery, children's toys, or even scraps of textile that survived thanks to stable underground conditions. These items preserved everyday life far more honestly than any chronicle ever could. Other rooms contained stranger surprises. In castles that frequently changed ownership, furniture or valuables hidden during times of crisis were sometimes left behind entirely. Archaeologists have found locked chests inside sealed rooms, their keys long lost, their contents preserved in eerie darkness. Most hold mundane objects, linens, coins, documents, but the emotional thrill of opening a chest, sealed since the 14th century, is indisputable. It is the closest thing medieval architecture offers to a treasure hunt. Some sealed chambers reveal darker moments. In a few castles, collapsed passages trapped storerooms mid-use, their shelves still lined with goods waiting for retrieval. Others contain evidence of hurried abandonment, scattered tools, dropped objects, or partially eaten meals. Fire-blackened walls show where smoke poured into a room before it was cut off. Even the dust layers reflect the violence or calmness of the moment when the chamber fell out of use. Less dramatic, but equally fascinating, are the architectural anomalies. A sealed stone arch leading nowhere. A staircase that ascends into a ceiling. A tiny door positioned bizarrely high on a wall. All signs that the castle once had a different shape, a different logic. These ghost structures map the castle's shifting identity over time. Modern rediscovery often happens accidentally. Renovators probing a wall might feel a hollow thud. Archaeologists crawling through drainage channels might find a crack that opens into a long-forgotten room. Even tourists occasionally stumble upon suspicious drafts or odd acoustics that reveal empty space behind the stone. One castle famously discovered an entire chapel hidden for centuries, its wall paintings preserved by pure architectural neglect. Lost chambers remind us that medieval castles weren't static relics but evolving organisms. They grew, adapted, faltered, and reinvented themselves, and in doing so they preserved secret pockets of the past. These forgotten rooms are quiet witnesses, holding fragments of lives no one recorded, objects no one meant to save, and stories no one expected to uncover. With the vanished rooms explored, we turn next to a different kind of hidden space, those deliberately created to fend off the supernatural. Welcome to the rituals, symbols, and mystical defences carved beneath castles in a world where spiritual danger felt as real as any army. Beneath the practical layers of medieval castles, the wells, the armories, the dungeons, the drainage tunnels, lay something far less tangible but no less important: superstition. The medieval world brimmed with unseen forces, spirits, curses, demons, saints, and the general belief that the universe was constantly watching, judging, and occasionally throwing rocks. To defend themselves, castle builders carved rituals into the stone, laid charms in the foundations, and created hidden chambers meant to keep the supernatural at bay. Nothing terrifies a demon like a chalk drawing made by someone who barely passed medieval math. From the moment the first stone was placed, superstition shaped construction. Builders often buried protective tokens beneath foundational blocks, animal bones, coins, herbs, charms, or even written prayers sealed in lead capsules. These weren't construction materials, they were spiritual insurance policies. A castle might withstand an army, but everyone feared the quiet misfortunes that arrived without warning. A child falling ill, crops failing, fires starting in places no fire should ever be. Better to slip a charm beneath the foundation than gamble with the unpredictable moods of the unseen. Some structures even incorporated ritual pits. These were small cavities dug into the earth before the foundation stones were laid, later filled with objects chosen for symbolic power. A pit might contain milk to evoke nourishment, honey for sweetness, iron for strength, or feathers to invoke divine protection. In a few cases, archaeologists found pits containing eggs, whole, unbroken, and likely meant to symbolize rebirth. It's charming until you realize someone had to carry those eggs down into the half-built foundation and lower them carefully into the soil, while hoping not to become omelette material. Hidden ritual chambers were rarer, but undeniably real. Some castles had tiny underground rooms used exclusively for spiritual rites, private prayers, or protective ceremonies. These spaces had no practical purpose. Too small for storage, too awkward for living, too isolated for meetings. Instead, they housed chalk symbols drawn on walls, shallow basins for burning herbs, or stone niches that once held religious items. Some chambers included low altars carved directly from the bedrock, their surfaces marked with soot or wax. These weren't grand chapels, they were intimate, secretive sanctuaries for moments when the castle needed quiet protection rather than public spectacle. Magical symbols adorned many underground walls, drawn or carved by workers, clergy or anxious residents. Circles were common, the simplest and most universal protective shape. Pentagrams, a spiritual symbol long before Hollywood horror got involved, guarded entryways, carved discreetly into pillars or archways. Interlocking triangles, spirals, and rune-like marks appeared near doors and junctions. These weren't random doodles, they were warding signs meant to confuse or repel harmful forces. And yet some symbols are so crooked and uneven that you can't help picturing the medieval mason muttering "close enough" before hurrying back to real work. Apotropaic marks, protective carvings, show up everywhere in castle basements. A popular one was the daisy wheel, a continuous geometric pattern thought to trap evil spirits in its endless looping lines. Another was the VV symbol, often interpreted as Virgin of Virgins, invoking Mary's protection. These symbols appear near thresholds, chimneys, hearths, storage rooms, and any place where misfortune was likely to sneak in. Medieval homeowners didn't wait for disaster, they decorated proactively. Superstitions also extended to burial wards. When dealing with ancestors and the dead, medieval people were both reverent and cautious. Some underground spaces contained boundary stones or consecrated markers intended to keep restless spirits from wandering. In rare cases, bodies were buried with iron nails placed strategically around them, a practice meant to pin the spirit in place rather than let it stroll through the castle at night. Medieval logic was imaginative, but it got the job done. One particularly strange custom involved embedding animal remains, often cats, into walls or floors as protective guardians. The theory was that the cat's spirit would defend the household from malevolent forces. Archaeologists uncover these witch cats occasionally, often preserved surprisingly well in dry stone cavities. The first time you see one, it's unsettling. The second time you realise medieval people really truly wanted supernatural security systems. Some castles even included spiritual barriers built into their foundations. These weren't physical barricades but symbolic ones. Lines of salt hidden beneath threshold stones, small shards of flint tucked into corners, or chalk boundaries marking sacred protective zones. These methods reflected a worldview in which physical and spiritual realms overlapped constantly. Every placement, every line, every object carried meaning, or at least enough meaning to make the household sleep easier. Ritual chambers sometimes doubled as places for divination or problem-solving. If a lord faced a decision involving war, law, or marriage alliances, he might consult an astrologer, cleric, or wise woman in a secluded basement room. Candles burned low, incense curled in the damp air. Symbols glowed faintly on the walls. It was as much psychological theatre as spiritual ritual. And in a world full of uncertainty, sometimes the theatre mattered more than the outcome. Even daily life incorporated these subterranean superstitions. Servants whispered charms while passing dark corridors. Guards traced symbols on doorframes for luck. Cooks tossed pinches of salt on thresholds to prevent misfortune from entering. When unexplained noises echoed through the castle, someone inevitably said, "Must be the spirits," even if the culprit was a rat wearing very heavy boots. Over centuries, these symbols and chambers often fell into obscurity. Some were plastered over, others faded into the stone, and many were forgotten entirely until archaeologists scraped away centuries of dust. Rediscovered, they tell a story that official histories never record, the story of fear, hope, belief, and imagination beneath medieval power. With these mystical layers examined, we turn now to something far more physical yet equally haunting: the bones buried beneath castle floors, the forgotten dead whose presence shaped medieval anxieties and archaeological discoveries alike. Beneath many medieval castles lies something far older, far quieter, and far harder to ignore once you know it's there. Bones, human bones, animal bones, entire burial grounds swallowed by centuries of construction, forgotten cemeteries paved over, battlefield dead hurriedly interred during desperate hours. And, woven among these very real histories, the stubborn myth that castle builders performed human sacrifices to strengthen the walls. Congrats, your castle sits on an ancient graveyard. Sleep tight. Long before castles claimed their hilltops, those same hills often served as burial sites for earlier communities. High ground symbolised closeness to the spiritual realm, and many prehistoric or early medieval settlements chose such places for graveyards. When lords of later centuries picked the same strategic high points for fortresses, they were rarely bothered by the presence of old bones. Land was land, and bones posed no threat to masonry. Builders simply cleared the surface graves, if they noticed them at all, then began construction. Anything deeper remained right where it had always been, layered beneath the foundation like a silent reminder that humans had lived and died here long before the first banner flew. As a result, many castle excavations reveal ancient cemeteries underneath the floors. Generations of forgotten people rest beneath layers of stone, their graves undisturbed, until archaeologists arrive centuries later armed with curiosity, trowels, and a strong stomach. Some graves belong to warriors, others to farmers, children, elders, entire families. Their presence creates an eerie overlap, the dead of one age supporting the living of another, as though the ground itself kept a ledger. But not all bones beneath castles came from earlier eras. Some were placed there intentionally, and not always ceremoniously. Medieval warfare often left casualties piled faster than burial crews could manage. During sieges, disease outbreaks, or sudden battles at the gates, castle inhabitants resorted to burial wherever there was space. That often meant hastily digging pits within castle grounds or sealing bodies in underground rooms that were no longer in use. Speed mattered more than ritual. You couldn't hold a proper funeral if the enemy was still firing arrows at your courtyard. Archaeological digs frequently uncover these emergency burials. Mass graves arranged with rough care, bodies laid side by side or sacked when time and labour ran short. Many show injuries from battle, sword cuts, arrowheads lodged in ribs, crushed limbs from siege weapon impacts. These remains provide raw physical testimony of the violence that official records often softened or skipped entirely. Then there were the more domestic dead: servants, lower-ranking soldiers, craftsmen, or travellers who died within castle walls but lacked family connections or wealth for elaborate burial. Their bodies might be placed near chapel crypts, in small courtyard graves, or even beneath floors later covered by renovations. It was not disrespect, it was reality. Medieval life was full of death, and castles were no exception. A person might serve the halls for decades, then spend their afterlife resting quietly beneath them. And inevitably, myths grew around these buried dead. One of the most persistent medieval beliefs involved construction sacrifices, the idea that offering a life-during building would ensure the structure's strength and protect it from collapse. These tales circulated widely. A shadowy figure walled into the cornerstone, a body hidden under the gatehouse, a child supposedly buried beneath a tower to give it spirit. In truth, archaeological evidence rarely supports actual human sacrifice during castle construction. But the stories were powerful. Fear gives myths longevity, and nothing unsettles workers quite like thinking the foundation wants a soul. More grounded rituals did occur. Builders sometimes placed animal bones beneath thresholds, not as sacrifices, but as symbolic offerings of protection or prosperity. A chicken wing beneath a foundation stone carries far less dramatic flair than a human sacrifice, but it reflects the same desire to court good fortune. Nonetheless, the darker legends persisted, whispered by masons during long nights and retold by later generations eager to imagine haunted walls. Bones found beneath castles also reveal everyday health and diet. Some skeletons show signs of malnutrition, arthritis, old injuries that healed imperfectly, or tooth decay severe enough to make anyone grateful for modern dentistry. Others reveal surprising longevity or physical strength, showcasing the range of lives lived beneath the shadow of stone towers. One particularly striking category includes children's remains. Medieval childhood was perilous and many children died young. Their burials, often simple and unadorned, can be found near chapels or incorporated into later renovations. These graves remind us that castles were not just fortresses, they were communities, with joys and tragedies interwoven into daily life. Occasionally, bones appear in places far more unexpected. A single skeleton discovered inside a sealed renovation cavity. A skull tucked beneath a staircase, perhaps repurposed accidentally with construction rubble. A handful of bones mixed with household debris, their presence unexplained but haunting. Each discovery forces historians to ask questions that records can't answer, and invites speculation about forgotten stories. Someone who vanished during a chaotic day, a worker caught in a collapse, a prisoner who never emerged from his cell. Over time, shifting foundations, collapsing floors, or rising soil levels created accidental ossuaries. Bones resurfaced or sank deeper. What began as a cemetery became a forgotten layer beneath a new kitchen. What started as a burial pit became a sealed room after a fire. Castles grew and changed while the dead remained motionless below. Today, archaeologists painstakingly document each bone, each tooth, each artifact buried beside them. Through forensic reconstruction, isotope analysis, and contextual study, the silent inhabitants beneath the floor reveal their stories, who they were, where they came from, what they ate, how they lived, and how they died. The castle becomes not just a fortress, but a multi-layered biography. And with the bones beneath the floor laid bare, our journey now moves to the final layer of hidden history. The reason medieval people found all of this perfectly normal, the mindset that embraced mystery, fear, ingenuity, and superstition beneath every stone of the medieval world. Exploring the hidden world beneath medieval castles feels like wandering through a labyrinth designed by someone who loved surprises and hated sunlight. Booby-trapped tunnels, sealed chambers, forgotten burials, mechanical contraptions, one pulley is away from disaster, inscriptions from bored guards and superstition-packed ritual spaces. It's enough to make anyone question how medieval people slept at night. The good news, you survived exploring medieval basements. The bad news, you now flinch every time you see a trapdoor. But to understand why all of this existed and why people accepted it, we must step back into the medieval mindset. A worldview shaped by fear, practicality, engineering limits, political paranoia, and deep omnipresent faith. To them, an underground world wasn't strange. It was necessary. First, fear. Medieval life was defined by vulnerability. War could erupt without warning. Bandits waited along trade routes. Rival lords held grudges like prized heirlooms. Castles weren't just homes, they were fortresses designed for survival, and survival required layers of protection both above and below ground. Hidden tunnels, storage vaults, escape routes, and secret armories weren't luxuries. They were lifelines. A family's entire legacy might depend on one unseen corridor or one secure underground room. The fear of sudden attack justified elaborate subterranean ingenuity. And then there was the practical fear of nature. Food spoiled, water ran dry, winter stretched on with bone-cracking cold. Disease lurked in every crowded room. Underground spaces offered stability, cool storage, protected wells, temperature control, and safety from storms. Instead of relying on unpredictable climate, medieval people turned to stone and soil, their most reliable allies. Modern minds might see a cellar as dreary, Medieval mines saw it as security. Engineering limitations also shaped these choices. Medieval builders understood stone intimately, but they lacked advanced materials like steel beams or reinforced concrete. To support massive halls and towering battlements, they needed sturdy bases. Undercrofts and vaulted chambers provided strength while also doubling as usable space. When you're building a fortress one chiseled block at a time, the smartest solution is to carve downward as much as upward. Subterranean chambers were simply efficient architecture, practical, strong, multi-purpose. Politics added a darker layer. Power was fragile, alliances unstable, and betrayal common. Hidden prison cells allowed nobles to negotiate from a position of strength. Secret hallways enabled private meetings and clandestine diplomacy. Vaults protected wealth from thieves and rival armies. Subfloor escape routes preserved lives during coups or rebellions. In a world where a whispered rumour could topple a dynasty, secrecy was not suspicion, it was self-preservation. The underground world became a political safety net, a place where truths could be hidden and decisions made without prying ears. Religion and superstition were equally influential. Medieval people saw the world through a spiritual lens. Heaven hovered above, hell yawned below, and earth stood trembling between them. Going underground meant entering a liminal space, a domain where spirits lingered, ancestors watched, and divine forces needed appeasing. Ritual chambers, protective symbols, relic vaults, and foundation charms all reflected the belief that the castle must be defended not only physically, but cosmically. To them, safeguarding a home required attention to both stone and soul. A chalked symbol on a doorframe mattered just as much as a barred gate. Daily experience reinforced these beliefs. People lived closer to danger, death, and mystery than we do now. They didn't question why tunnels existed, they questioned how to make them safer. They didn't wonder why crypts lay beneath chapels, they wondered whether the saints within offered enough protection. They didn't marvel at secret rooms, they assumed every fortress had them, because of course a wise lord left himself options. Even the idea of normal was different. A medieval castle was not a place of comfort, it was a machine for survival. Everything had purpose, everything had consequence, and everything, visibly or invisibly, worked toward the same goal, preserving life and authority in an unpredictable world. If that required complex wells, labyrinthine corridors, mystical symbols, underground stables, and escape tunnels that smelled like damp socks, so be it. Normalcy was defined not by modern convenience, but by medieval necessity. There was also an aesthetic acceptance of the unknown. Medieval people embraced mystery, wonder, and the belief that unseen forces shaped their world. Darkness was not just absence of light, it was a realm of imagination, caution, and possibility. The underground world echoed that ethos perfectly. It held secrets, dangers, hopes, and history. It was a place where reality blurred with superstition, where engineering blurred with magic, and where practical needs blurred with political manoeuvring. In that sense, the underground world beneath a castle was a mirror of the medieval mind, layered, cautious, creative, fearful, hopeful, and determined to survive by whatever means necessary. So when you look back at these basements full of traps, treasures, bones, blessings, forgotten rooms, and suspiciously creaky mechanisms, remember, medieval life wasn't puzzled by any of it. They saw a fortress built not just with stone, but with strategy, with memory, with belief. And with that, we've reached the end of our descent. You've travelled through centuries of hidden rooms and invisible histories, and you've emerged wiser, and perhaps slightly more suspicious of any flaw that sounds hollow.